Welcome to Whispering Willow's Sleep, soft-spoken tales to slow the day's thoughts and carry you toward peaceful sleep. Before we begin, tell me where in the world you're listening from tonight, and, if you wish, what's on your mind. I read every note and love keeping quiet company across distances. If this brings you peace, a like and subscribe help me make more nightbound stories. And if you'd like to support even further, you can buy me a coffee through the link in the description. Now, settle in, get comfortable, and breathe with me as we begin. The fire in the grate had settled into a rhythm of its own, crackling softly with the contentment of well-aged oak meeting flame. The scent of pipe tobacco mingled with the faint mustiness of old books, creating an atmosphere that seemed to exist outside of time itself. In the sitting room at 221B Baker Street, the world narrowed to the warmth of firelight, dancing across burgundy wallpaper, the gentle tick of the mantel clock, and the sound of autumn rain tapping against the window like a visitor too polite to knock loudly. Sherlock Holmes sat in his chair, legs crossed, fingers steepled beneath his chin, in that peculiar attitude of contemplation that his companion had come to recognize as the prelude to either brilliant insight or profound boredom. The gaslight hissed softly from its fixture on the wall, casting shadows that seemed to lean in, curious about the detective's thoughts. Outside, London wrapped itself in its evening fog, that thick November mist that turned every street lamp into a golden blur and every footstep into a mystery. Dr. John Watson sat opposite. The Times spread across his lap, though his attention had wandered from the day's headlines to the comforting mundanity of the scene before him. After the chaos of their previous case, a tedious affair involving a stolen brooch and a remarkably unimaginative jewel thief, this quiet evening felt like a blessing. The rain had kept visitors away, and Mrs. Hudson had retired early, leaving the two men to the peaceful solitude that Baker Street offered so rarely. The year was 1894, and London had settled into that curious state between centuries, neither fully Victorian in its rigid propriety, nor quite ready to embrace the new age that lurked just beyond the horizon. The city sprawled beneath its blanket of coal smoke and fog, a living thing of iron and stone, of ambition and desperation, where electric lights were beginning to challenge the supremacy of gas, and where spiritualism competed with science for the public's wandering attention. It was a city of contradictions, this London, a place where the Crystal Palace still gleamed with yesterday's dreams of progress, while the East End huddled in shadows that no amount of glass and iron could illuminate. Holmes stirred, reaching for his pipe, and Watson recognized the movement as a sign of restlessness. The detective thrived on puzzles the way plants thrived on sunlight, and this evening's lack of intellectual stimulation was clearly beginning to chafe. "The rain," Holmes murmured, as if continuing a conversation they hadn't been having, "is expected to continue through Thursday. The barometric pressure suggests a front settling over the Thames Valley for at least 3 more days." Watson smiled behind his newspaper. "I'm sure the weather will be devastated to learn you've deciphered its intentions." "Everything has patterns, Watson. Weather is merely more honest about them than people." It was at that moment, as if summoned by Holmes' restlessness, or perhaps by some theatrical sense of timing that the universe occasionally indulged in, that the sound of footsteps echoed up the stairs. Not Mrs. Hudson's familiar tread, but something quicker, lighter, carrying with it an urgency that made both men straighten in their chairs. The knock, when it came, was perfunctory, barely waiting for acknowledgement, before the door swung open to reveal a messenger boy, perhaps 14 years old, dripping with rain and slightly out of breath. His uniform marked him as belonging to the district messenger service, though the state of his boots suggested he'd been running through streets that the service's respectable clientele rarely considered. "Mr. Holmes?" the boy gasped, water pooling at his feet on Mrs. Hudson's carefully maintained floor. "Evidently," Holmes replied, already rising from his chair with a grace that suggested he'd been coiled and waiting for exactly this interruption. "You've come from the East End, Whitechapel specifically, based on the particular composition of mud on your left boot. You stopped at 3 locations before arriving here, one of them a public house, where someone spilled gin on your sleeve approximately 20 minutes ago. The message you carry has been paid for in advance with a sovereign, which is considerably more than the standard rate, suggesting either desperation or theatricality on the part of your employer." The boy's mouth opened slightly, then closed. He fumbled in his coat and produced an envelope, sealed with red wax that gleamed like a wound in the firelight. Holmes took it with the careful delicacy of a surgeon accepting a scalpel. The envelope itself was of good quality, not exceptional, but certainly better than common correspondence. The wax seal bore no distinguishing marks, no family crest or personal insignia, just a smooth circle of scarlet that seemed oddly insistent in its anonymity. "Wait downstairs," Holmes instructed the boy, pressing a coin into his hand. "There may be a reply." As the messenger's footsteps retreated, Watson found himself standing without quite remembering the decision to do so. Something about the envelope held his attention, perhaps the way Holmes turned it over in his hands, examining it from every angle before breaking the seal, or perhaps simply the fact that it had arrived on an evening so thoroughly designed for peace. The detective broke the seal with a thumbnail, and Watson heard the whisper of paper unfolding. The room seemed to hold its breath, the fire settling even quieter, the rain softening against the window as if trying to eavesdrop. Holmes read in silence, his face betraying nothing but the slight narrowing of his eyes that Watson had learned to interpret as genuine interest. Then, without a word, he crossed to the desk and struck a match, holding the envelope itself to the flame and watching it curl and blacken in the brass ashtray kept for precisely such purposes. "Holmes?" Watson ventured. The detective turned, holding the letter out to his friend. "Tell me what you make of this, Watson. And do be honest. I value your perspective precisely because it differs from my own." Watson accepted the paper, noting the weight of it, the slight texture that suggested quality. The handwriting was elaborate, almost calligraphic, executed with either great care or practiced ease. But it was the content that made him pause, his medical training and rational mind immediately bristling at what lay before his eyes. And when he had opened the 7th seal, there was silence in heaven. "And I saw the 7 angels which stood before God. And the angel took the censer and filled it with fire of the altar and cast it into the earth. The beast that thou sawest was, and is not, and shall ascend. His path is made clear on the 7th day, when the moon hangs full over the river's bend, where glass and iron meet the sky, where crystal dreams hold ancient lies. 7 seals shall break at midnight's chime. The first covenant ends, the second begins." Watson read it twice, then looked up at Holmes with the expression of a man being asked to take seriously what he knew to be nonsense. It's biblical. Revelation, unless I'm very much mistaken. With additions. Revelations, chapter 8, verses 1 through 5, to be precise. Holmes confirmed, returning to his chair and relighting his pipe. Though somewhat mangled in the transcription and liberally embellished with what I can only describe as amateur poetry. Note the shift from scripture to original verse, where glass and iron meet the sky. The writer either considers themselves a poet or wishes to appear so. Occult nonsense, Watson said firmly, though he found himself reading the letter again, unable to shake a certain unease that had nothing to do with belief and everything to do with the earnestness of the handwriting. Some crank with a Bible and too much time. Perhaps, Holmes murmured, and there was something in his tone that made Watson look up sharply. And yet, they paid a sovereign for delivery? That's not the behaviour of a common crank. That's the behaviour of someone who believes, genuinely believes, that this message is worth the expense. The rain had intensified, drumming now against the window with more insistence, and somewhere in the distance a church bell tolled the hour. 9 o'clock. London's evening was settling. In properly now, the city's honest workers heading home, its less honest citizens venturing out. And somewhere in the space between, the fog continued its patient work of erasing boundaries and blurring certainties. Watson set the letter on the side table with more force than necessary. Holmes, surely you're not suggesting we take this seriously. The city is full of spiritualists and mystics, each more theatrical than the last. This is probably some elaborate attempt to... To what, Watson? Holmes interrupted gently, smoke curling from his pipe like questions forming in the air. To lure me into investigating shadows. To what end? No, I think this is something rather more interesting than theatrical nonsense, precisely because it tries so hard to appear as such. He leaned forward, and Watson saw the familiar spark in his friend's eyes, that peculiar intensity that appeared when a puzzle presented itself, when the world suddenly became legible, in a way it hadn't been moments before. Consider the specifics embedded in the poetry, Holmes continued. Where glass and iron meet the sky, there is only one location in London that fits such a description with any certainty. The Crystal Palace, that great monument to Victorian ambition, still standing in Sydenham, still attracting its daily pilgrims of progress and nostalgia. Watson felt his scepticism waver slightly. You think this refers to an actual location? I think, my dear Watson, that someone has gone to considerable trouble to disguise practical information as mystical prophecy. The question is, why? Why wrap coordinates in scriptural garb? Why speak of seals and beasts and covenants when a simple address would suffice? Holmes stood and moved to the window, pulling back the curtain to reveal the fog-draped street below. A hansom cab rattled past, its lamps 2 dim eyes in the murk. Somewhere a woman's laugh echoed and faded. London continued its nightly business, unconcerned with mysteries and ciphers, with seals and prophecies, with whatever game was beginning in the room above Baker Street. Because, Holmes answered his own question, they wish either to be taken for madmen or to speak to someone who understands their particular language, and the fact that they've sent this to me suggests the latter. Watson joined him at the window, the 2 men standing side by side as they'd stood countless times before, looking out at a city that never quite revealed all its secrets. The fog pressed against the glass like something alive, and Watson found himself thinking of the letter's words. The beast that was and is not and shall ascend, and wondering why such obvious nonsense should suddenly seem less obvious in the gathering dark. "What do you propose?" Watson asked, knowing the answer before it came. Holmes smiled, and there was something boyish in it, something that reminded Watson why he'd chosen to share these rooms and these adventures, despite all good sense, suggesting a quieter life. "I propose we wait for the 7th day and the full moon. According to my almanac, that occurs this coming Saturday, and I propose we visit the Crystal Palace and see what, if anything, transpires where glass and iron meet the sky. And if nothing happens, if this is merely what it appears, the ravings of someone who's read too much scripture and too many penny dreadfuls, then we shall have had a pleasant evening out, Watson. The palace is rather magnificent at night, I'm told. They've recently installed electric lighting throughout the grounds. Quite the spectacle." Watson returned to his chair, picking up the letter once more. The handwriting stared back at him, each letter formed with such care, such deliberation. This wasn't the scrawl of madness. It was something more organized, more intentional. And that, perhaps, was what unsettled him most. "The writer knows you," Watson observed, "or knows of you. They chose you specifically to receive this." "Indeed, which suggests they either want me to stop something or to witness it. The question of which possibility troubles me considerably more than you might expect." The fire popped, sending a small shower of sparks up the chimney, and Mrs. Hudson's cat, a grey creature of dubious temperament that had adopted the building rather than any specific resident, appeared from somewhere and wound itself around Holmes's chair leg, purring like distant thunder. Outside, London stretched away in all directions, a vast puzzle of streets and lives, of secrets and lies, of perfectly ordinary evil and perfectly mysterious good. In drawing rooms across the city, people were settling down to their evening routines, unaware that somewhere in their midst, someone was writing biblical verses and calling them prophecy. Someone was planning something elaborate enough to require codes and mystery. Something that involved seals and beasts and the meeting of glass and iron under a full moon's light. Holmes settled back into his chair, the letter now lying on the desk between them, and Watson saw his friend's face take on that distant expression that meant his mind was already racing ahead, connecting patterns that hadn't yet revealed themselves, seeing implications in what appeared to be simple words. "You know, Watson," Holmes said softly, his voice almost lost beneath the rain and the fire's murmur. "London has always had a peculiar relationship with the mystical. We pride ourselves on our rationality, our science, our modern sensibilities. We build crystal palaces and railway stations. We light our streets with gas and soon with electricity. We catalogue and classify and quantify everything we can reach. And yet—" He paused, drawing on his pipe, and Watson waited. "And yet, we also flock to seances and spirit mediums. We publish more books on ghosts and demons than any rational city should. We hide our fears in Victorian propriety and our doubts in scientific certainty. But they're still there, waiting. Someone understands that. Someone is using it. Using what? The gap between what we believe and what we pretend to believe. The space where fear lives alongside reason. It's a clever disguise, Watson. Hide your criminal enterprise in the trappings of the occult, and half of London will dismiss you as a charlatan, while the other half is too frightened to investigate closely. Watson considered this, finding a certain uncomfortable logic in it. Victorian society did indeed walk a strange line between enlightenment and superstition, between the laboratory and the séance room, between electric light and candle-lit rituals. It was a city, an entire era, trying to have things both ways, and perhaps that contradiction created precisely the shadows in which clever criminals could operate. The clock ticked on. The rain continued its patient work. And somewhere in London, if Holmes was right, someone was waiting for Saturday night, for the full moon, for glass and iron to meet sky, for whatever ceremony or crime or curious combination of both was encoded in those biblical verses. Watson folded the letter carefully and handed it back to Holmes, who accepted it without a word and placed it in his notebook. That growing collection of curious communications and strange appeals that seemed to multiply despite his best efforts to maintain order. "Well then," Watson said, settling back with his newspaper, though he knew he wouldn't read another word of it tonight. "Saturday it is, though I suspect we'll find nothing more sinister than some eccentric society holding a midnight reading group." Holmes smiled behind his pipe smoke, and the smile suggested he knew something Watson didn't, or perhaps simply that he hoped to. Perhaps. But then again, Watson, the most interesting crimes are always the ones that try hardest not to look like crimes at all. The fire crackled its agreement, or perhaps its skepticism. It was hard to tell with fires. And as the evening deepened, and the fog pressed closer, and London settled into its nightly rituals of gas lamps and drawn curtains, of secrets kept and secrets whispered, the letter lay in Holmes' notebook, waiting for Saturday, waiting for the moon, waiting for whatever truth lay hidden beneath its ornate script and borrowed prophecies. Outside, somewhere in the labyrinth of streets and alleys, the author of that letter was perhaps looking at the same fog, the same darkness, and thinking thoughts that remained, for now, mercifully unknown. Morning arrived in London the way it always did in November, reluctantly, as if the sun itself needed convincing that the effort was worthwhile. The fog that had settled over the city the night before had thinned, but not departed, lingering in the corners and crevices of the metropolis like a guest who'd overstayed their welcome, but couldn't quite find their coat. From the window of 221B Baker Street, the world appeared rendered in watercolours, all soft edges and muted tones. The buildings across the way standing like apologetic shadows of themselves. Holmes had been awake for hours, Watson could tell. The breakfast table bore evidence of an early meal consumed with the efficiency of a man whose mind was elsewhere. A half-empty teacup gone cold, toast reduced to crumbs, the morning papers spread in careful array as if they were evidence at a crime scene, which, in Holmes's world, they often were. The detective himself stood at his chemistry table, peering into a beaker with the intensity of a priest, reading omens in smoke. "Ah, Watson," he said without turning, somehow aware of his friend's presence, through means Watson had long since stopped trying to understand. "I trust you slept well?" "The rain stopped around 4, though I suspect it's merely gathering its strength for another performance this evening." Watson poured himself tea from the pot Mrs. Hudson had left, warming by the fire. The ritual of it, the weight of the pot, the steam rising, the familiar chink of china, provided a comfortable anchor to the morning. Outside, London was stirring into life, the city's great machinery of commerce and survival, grinding into motion with the sound of hooves on cobblestones, the calls of street vendors, the distant whistle of a train pulling into one of the great stations that had transformed the city's geography over the past half-century. "I trust you haven't been conducting experiments all night?" Watson asked, though he already knew the answer. "Merely testing a theory about paper composition," Holmes replied, finally turning away from his beaker with a satisfied expression. "The letter we received last evening was written on paper manufactured at the Holloway Mill, which supplies primarily to ecclesiastical suppliers and a handful of specialty stationers in the Strand. Not definitive, but suggestive." He moved to the window, pulling back the curtain with the air of a theatre director checking on his audience. Below, Baker Street was performing its morning routines, a milk cart rattling past, a governess hurrying along with her charges, a policeman on his beat, nodding to passers-by with the solid assurance of British authority. It was a scene repeated in various configurations across the city, this daily resurrection of routine, this agreement among millions that today would be more or less like yesterday. "I've made inquiries," Holmes continued, and Watson recognized the tone. His friend had clearly not spent the entire night at his chemistry table. "About our Crystal Palace, specifically about events scheduled for this coming Saturday evening. And nothing official. No concerts, no exhibitions, no grand openings, which is, in itself, interesting. The palace rarely sits idle, especially on a Saturday. It's a venue in search of perpetual purpose, you see. That grand monument to the Great Exhibition of 1851, now relocated to Sydenham and rather desperately trying to justify its existence through an endless parade of displays and entertainments." Holmes returned to the breakfast table, finally pouring himself a fresh cup of tea. The morning light, such as it was, caught the angles of his face, and Watson thought, not for the first time, that his friend looked like London itself, sharp, intelligent, angular, and slightly haunted by something he'd never quite articulate. "However," Holmes continued, settling into his chair with the grace of a cat claiming territory, "I did discover something rather curious. There was an incident at the palace 3 weeks ago. Minor vandalism, officially. Someone broke into one of the storage areas beneath the main exhibition hall. Nothing was reported stolen, but the lock had been forced and several crates disturbed. Hardly seems connected to our mysterious letter. Perhaps not, but the security guard who discovered the break-in reported hearing what he described as chanting coming from the area shortly before he investigated. He was dismissed as superstitious. The man's Irish, you see, and apparently that's sufficient cause for his employers to doubt his every observation." Watson felt the first stirrings of genuine interest, that particular tightening of attention that came when a case began to take shape, when random elements started suggesting pattern. What sort of chanting? He couldn't say. He's not a literary man, our guard, but he was quite insistent it sounded biblical. Like something from church, he said, but wrong somehow. Backwards or mixed up. The two men sat in silence for a moment, the only sounds the ticking of the mantel clock and the distant rumble of London going about its business. Victorian society was like that, a thin veneer of order stretched over a roiling mass of contradictions, where scientific progress marched alongside spiritualism, where electric lights competed with seances, where every rational achievement seemed to summon an equal and opposite mystical reaction. "We should visit the palace today," Holmes announced, setting down his cup with the decisiveness of a judge's gavel. "Speak to this guard ourselves, and perhaps examine the area where the incident occurred. Saturday is 3 days away, and I dislike waiting when investigation is possible." Watson nodded, already mentally preparing for the journey. The Crystal Palace sat in Sydenham, south of the Thames, requiring either a rail journey or a considerably lengthy cab ride. Either option would take them out of the London they knew, the London of Baker Street and Scotland Yard, of gentlemen's clubs and comfortable routine, and into the city's sprawling suburbs, where the working classes had built their own version of metropolitan life amid the factories and terraced houses that fed the empire's appetite for goods and growth. "I'll fetch my coat," Watson said, rising, "and perhaps my revolver, if you think—" "I think, Watson, that we are investigating theatrical nonsense that happens to involve breaking and entering. Your medical bag would be more practical than your revolver, though I appreciate the sentiment behind the offer." An hour later, they found themselves at Victoria Station, that great cathedral of iron and glass where all of southern England seemed to funnel through on its way to and from the capital. The station was a world unto itself, a vast covered space where the air tasted of coal smoke and possibility, where the ground trembled with the constant arrival and departure of trains, where humanity pressed together in temporary intimacy before dispersing again to their separate destinations. Holmes navigated the crowd with the ease of a man who understood that people, like water, followed predictable currents. They found their platform, boarded a second-class carriage that smelled of damp wool and yesterday's newspapers, and settled in for the journey south. Through the window, London transformed as they travelled. The grand buildings of Westminster giving way to the tighter streets of Southwark, then to the newer developments where the city was busy inventing suburbs. Those curious compromises between urban and rural life that Victorian society had embraced with characteristic enthusiasm. The other passengers in their carriage were the usual mix. A clerk with ink-stained fingers and worried eyes, a woman in morning dress who stared at nothing with the patience of profound grief, 2 young men arguing about cricket with the passion that only the truly bored can muster. Holmes observed them all with his customary discretion, reading their lives in the details they couldn't hide, the frayed cuffs that spoke of genteel poverty, the new wedding ring that announced recent hopes, the calloused hands that told stories of labour their Sunday clothes tried to deny. "London," Holmes murmured, as if continuing a thought Watson hadn't heard begin, "is really 1,000 villages that happen to share the same fog, each neighbourhood its own country, with its own rules and hierarchies. The man who rules a street in Whitechapel might as well be invisible in Mayfair. The woman who's a pillar of society in Clapham wouldn't be acknowledged in Belgravia. We pretend we're one city, but we're an empire of small territories, each defending its own particular version of respectability." Watson watched the landscape roll past, factories giving way to fields that gave way to new construction sites, where London's next iteration was being hammered and mortared into existence. "And Sydenham, what sort of village is that?" "Ambitious," Holmes replied. "It was farmland until the Crystal Palace arrived, you know. Then suddenly it was the destination. Thousands came to see the great marvel relocated from Hyde Park, this temple to progress and industry, this shrine to everything Victorian society claimed to believe in. And around it, Sydenham tried to become something grander than a market town. built itself up, invited the middle classes to settle, promised culture and refinement within commuting distance of the city. And succeeded? Holmes smiled, but there was something wry in it. It succeeded in creating exactly what it set out to create. Another place for people to pretend they've escaped London while remaining entirely dependent on it. The palace itself is rather magnificent, though. I'll grant them that. It's a monument to the peculiar Victorian belief that you can capture progress in glass and iron, bottle ambition in architecture, and somehow make permanence out of the very thing designed to celebrate change. The train slowed, the rhythm of wheels on rails changing pitch, and through the window the Crystal Palace came into view. Even in the grey morning light, even through the persistent fog, it was extraordinary. A vast structure of glass panels and iron framework that seemed to challenge gravity itself, rising from the hillside like something from a fever dream, all glittering surfaces and impossible scale. It looked, Watson thought, like a cathedral designed by engineers, a church built to worship not God, but human achievement itself. They disembarked at Sydenham Hill Station, joining the thin stream of morning visitors making their way toward the palace. The area around the station had that recently built quality. Streets too wide, buildings too new, everything trying just a bit too hard to announce its respectability. Shop fronts gleamed with fresh paint, and small gardens were maintained with the aggressive care of people determined to prove their status through horticulture. The walk to the palace took them uphill, past rows of terraced houses where lace curtains twitched with the curiosity of those who had nothing better to do than monitor their neighbours. Holmes moved with purpose, his walking stick tapping a steady rhythm on the pavement, his eyes constantly scanning, cataloguing, storing information in that extraordinary mind of his that seemed to forget nothing and forgive even less. The palace grounds opened before them, extensive gardens laid out with Victorian precision, pathways winding between carefully cultivated beds that in summer would burst with colour, but now held only the stubborn remains of autumn. The building itself dominated everything, its glass walls reflecting the sky in 1,000 fragmented images, making it seem less like a structure and more like a mirage, something that might vanish if you looked away too long. They approached the main entrance, where a ticket seller sat in a small booth looking thoroughly bored with the prospects of his day. Holmes purchased entry, with the same casual efficiency he brought to every transaction, treating money as a necessary inconvenience, rather than something worthy of attention. Inside, the palace opened up into vast galleries, where the air tasted of metal and glass and the accumulated dust of decades of exhibitions. The space was cavernous, and their footsteps echoed as they walked, the sound bouncing off distant walls, and returning changed, multiplied, as if the building itself was whispering commentary on their presence. The vandalism occurred in the lower storage areas, Holmes said quietly, though there was no one near enough to overhear. Beneath the north wing, according to my information. But first, I think we should speak to our Irish guard. I sent word ahead that we'd be visiting. He should be expecting us. They found the man in a small office tucked away near the loading docks, a room that smelled of tea gone cold, and the particular loneliness of night work. The guard himself was perhaps 50, with the weathered face of someone who'd seen more than they'd wanted, and the careful courtesy of those who'd learned that deference was the price of employment. "Mr. Holmes," he said, standing quickly as they entered. "I'm Patrick O'Reilly. Got your message this morning, sir. Wasn't sure you'd actually come." "I go where the questions lead, Mr. O'Reilly," Holmes replied, settling into a chair without waiting for invitation. "And you, I'm told, have heard some rather unusual questions being chanted in the darkness. Tell me about that evening. Every detail, no matter how insignificant it seems." O'Reilly glanced at Watson, then back to Holmes, clearly trying to gauge whether he was being mocked or taken seriously. Whatever he saw in Holmes's face seemed to reassure him, and he sat down heavily, his hands folded on the desk in front of him like a penitent at confession. It was 3 weeks back, Tuesday night, late, past midnight, coming up on 1 o'clock. I was doing my rounds, checking the lower levels like always. The palace is a big place, sir, and at night it's like a cathedral, if you'll pardon the comparison. Everything echoes, and you hear things that aren't there, or at least you think they aren't there. "But this was there," Holmes prompted gently. "Aye, sir. I heard it clear, as I'm hearing you now. Voices, more than one, I'd swear to it, coming from the storage area beneath the North Gallery. Chanting, but not a language I knew. Words from the Bible, I thought, but mixed up. Backwards, maybe. It had that quality, you understand, that sound of scripture being said, but wrong." Watson watched the man's face as he spoke, and saw genuine fear there, the kind that couldn't be faked. Whatever O'Reilly had heard, he believed it was real. And more than that, he believed it was significant. "And when you investigated?" Holmes asked. "Found the lock forced. The door was still swinging on its hinges. Inside, some crates had been moved, opened maybe, but nothing seemed missing. I reported it straight away, but the management—" He trailed off, and Watson could fill in the rest. The management had dismissed an Irish guard's concerns, probably attributing them to drink or superstition or both. "Did you see anyone?" "No, sir. Whoever it was, they'd gone by the time I got there. But the air, it smelled of something. Incense, maybe. Something sweet and heavy, not normal for a storage room." Holmes stood abruptly, his entire demeanor shifting from casual interest to focused intensity. "Show us this room, Mr. O'Reilly, and bring your keys. I suspect it's time we had a look at what your mysterious chanters found so interesting." They descended into the bowels of the Crystal Palace, leaving behind the grand galleries and ornate displays for a utilitarian world of brick and shadow. The lower levels were service areas, places where the machinery of spectacle was maintained, where the less glamorous work of keeping a monument operational happened out of sight of the paying public. O'Reilly led them through narrow corridors lit by occasional gas lamps, the air growing cooler and damper as they went deeper. Watson found himself thinking about the letter, about seals and beasts and prophecies, and wondering what they would find in the darkness beneath this temple to progress and light. The storage room, when they reached it, was exactly what one would expect. A large space stacked with crates and carved furniture, the accumulated detritus of exhibitions past and perhaps future. The lock on the door bore clear marks of forcing, the metal scratched and bent, where someone had applied leverage with more determination than skill. Holmes entered first, producing a small lantern from his coat pocket and lighting it with the casual ease of a man who always came prepared. The light pushed back the shadows, revealing rows of crates marked with exotic destinations, specimens from India, artifacts from Egypt, curiosities from Australia. The palace, in its ambition to display the world's wonders, had accumulated the world's leftovers. "Here, sir," O'Reilly said, pointing to an area near the back wall where several crates had clearly been disturbed, their positions different from the dust patterns around them. "This is where they'd been." Holmes knelt, examining the floor with the concentration of a priest studying holy text. Watson watched as his friend's long fingers traced patterns in the dust, as his eyes tracked movements invisible to normal sight. This was Holmes at his best, reading the language of evidence, translating the grammar of disturbance into narrative, finding story where others saw only disorder. "3 people," Holmes murmured, more to himself than to his companions. 2 men and a woman, based on boot sizes and stride length. They entered through the door O'Reilly found forced, but they'd been here before. See how they moved directly to these specific crates? No searching, no hesitation. They knew exactly what they were looking for. "And did they find it?" Watson asked. Holmes stood, brushing dust from his knees, his face illuminated eerily by the lantern light. "That, Watson, is the question, isn't it? These crates contain religious artifacts, crosses, candlesticks, vestments, items collected for an exhibition on ecclesiastical history that apparently never materialized. Our visitors opened 3 crates, examined their contents, and left everything behind. So either they found what they needed, and it was small enough to conceal, or they were merely confirming the contents were here," Watson finished, "for some future purpose." "Precisely." Holmes turned to O'Reilly, who had been watching this display of deduction with the expression of a man witnessing either genius or madness, and unable to determine which. "Mr. O'Reilly, has anyone else shown unusual interest in this area? Any visitors asking questions about storage, about what's kept down here?" The guard thought for a moment, his brow furrowed. "There was a gentleman, maybe a week before the break-in, said he was writing a book about the palace, asked if he could take a tour of the backstage areas, as he called them. I told him he'd need to speak to management about that." "And did he?" "Don't know, sir. Never saw him again." Holmes nodded slowly, his eyes distant with thought. They stood there in the storage room beneath the Crystal Palace, surrounded by artifacts of faith and history, while above them thousands of glass panels held back the grey November sky, and London went about its business, unaware of mysteries being puzzled out in the darkness below. "Thank you, Mr. O'Reilly," Holmes said finally. "You've been most helpful. One last question. On Saturday night, will you be working?" "I will, sir. Always work Saturdays. Busier then. See, more visitors to keep an eye on." "Good. If you observe anything unusual, anyone acting strangely, any gatherings after closing, anything at all, I want you to send word to me immediately at Baker Street. Don't try to intervene yourself, merely observe and report." They emerged back into the thin daylight, like divers surfacing from deep water, blinking at the change. The palace stretched around them, that impossible edifice of Victorian ambition, and Watson found himself looking at it differently now, seeing not just the showcase of progress, but the shadows it cast, the spaces beneath where other stories unfolded, where mysteries waited in the dark. As they walked back toward the station, Holmes was silent, his mind clearly working through permutations and possibilities. Watson knew better than to interrupt such thoughts. Instead, he watched the people they passed, the respectable families taking their morning constitutional, the nurses with their charges, the gentlemen reading newspapers on benches, and wondered how many of them knew about the codes hidden in Scripture, about forced locks and midnight chanting, about whatever was planned for Saturday night when glass and iron met sky under a full moon's gaze. "Watson," Holmes said at last, as they waited on the platform for the train back to London, "I believe we're dealing with something rather more organized than a simple band of occult enthusiasts. The letter, the break-in, the careful planning, these speak to purpose, to structure. Someone is using the language of mysticism to accomplish something decidedly practical. But what? And why go to such elaborate lengths?" Holmes smiled, but there was no humour in it. "That, my dear friend, is precisely what we're going to find out. But I suspect, when we do, we'll discover that the most frightening thing about this mystery isn't the talk of devils and prophecies. It's the mundane human greed that's hiding behind them." The train arrived and they boarded, beginning the journey back to Baker Street, to the familiar comfort of their rooms, to the safety of routine. But something had changed, Watson felt. Some thread had been pulled, some pattern disturbed, and there was no telling where it would lead before Saturday night arrived, with its full moon and its promises hidden in borrowed prophecies. London waited, vast and indifferent, keeping its secrets as it always had, as it always would, while in their midst Holmes and Watson prepared to chase one more mystery through the fog-draped streets of the greatest city the world had ever known. The afternoon had turned that peculiar shade of grey that London seemed to specialise in, not quite dark enough to warrant lamps, not quite light enough to work comfortably without them. Back in the sitting-room at Baker Street, Holmes had commandeered the entire dining table, spreading across its surface a collection of materials that would have looked like chaos to anyone unfamiliar with his methods. Maps of London competed for space with reference books on biblical texts. Shipping schedules lay atop architectural drawings of the Crystal Palace, and in the centre of it all, the mysterious letter sat like a sphinx, guarding its riddle. Watson had settled into his customary chair with a cup of tea that had long since gone cold, watching his friend work with the fascination of a man observing a master craftsman. Holmes moved between the scattered papers with balletic precision, his long fingers selecting and discarding information with the speed of a card sharp working a deck. The pipe clenched between his teeth had gone out twice, forgotten in the intensity of his concentration. "The Book of Revelation," Holmes murmured, not looking up from the biblical concordance he'd borrowed from the vicar at St. Marylebone, "is perhaps the most coded document in Christian scripture. Written during Roman persecution, its author, traditionally identified as John of Patmos, employed elaborate symbolism to discuss political realities without inviting immediate martyrdom. The number 6666, for instance, likely refers to Nero Caesar, if you calculate the Hebrew numerology correctly. "Holmes," Watson said, setting down his teacup with gentle exasperation, "I appreciate the theological education, but how does this help us understand our mysterious letter?" Holmes looked up, and there was that gleam in his eye that Watson had learned to recognize. The expression of a man who'd found the key to unlock a particularly satisfying puzzle. "Because, Watson, our letter writer isn't the first to use biblical text as cipher. The tradition is ancient and, I'm discovering, remarkably sophisticated. Consider, If you assign each book of the Bible a number, each chapter within that book another number, and each verse a coordinate, you've created a substitution system that appears to be religious devotion, but is actually a very practical code. He stood, moving to the map of London he'd pinned to the wall, his finger tracing a route that Watson couldn't yet perceive. Our letter mentions the Book of Revelation, specifically chapter 8. But then it adds original verse, where glass and iron meet the sky. That's not scriptural, that's geographic, the Crystal Palace, as we've established. But what if the other elements aren't mystical at all? What if they're directions? Watson rose from his chair, drawn by the possibility threading through Holmes's words. You're saying the biblical references are coordinates? More than that, I'm saying they're a complete system. Holmes returned to the table, pulling out a sheet where he'd been making notes in his precise, angular hand. Look at the original letter again. The seventh seal. Revelation has 7 seals, 7 trumpets, 7 bowls of wrath. 7 is the organizing principle. Now, if we assume 7 doesn't mean mystical perfection, but rather a specific number in a sequence. He paused, pulling out a shipping schedule from the Port of London Authority, a document Watson hadn't even noticed him acquiring. I made some inquiries this morning while you were having breakfast. There are 7 major warehouses along the Thames between Wapping and Limehouse, all operated by the same consortium, the Meridian Trading Company. Each one numbered, naturally enough, 1 through 7. Watson felt understanding beginning to dawn, that peculiar sensation of seeing patterns emerge from what had seemed like random noise. And the beast's path? The Thames itself, Watson. In medieval cartography, sea serpents and beasts were often drawn in bodies of water. But more practically, if you're smuggling goods into London, the river is your highway. It's been that way since Roman times. The Thames is the beast that carries commerce, legal and otherwise, into the heart of the empire. Holmes moved with growing excitement now, his energy filling the room like electricity before a storm. He laid the shipping schedule beside the map, then added a tide table, his fingers dancing across the papers as if conducting a silent orchestra. The letter mentions the moon, when the moon hangs full over the river's bend. That's not poetic atmosphere. That's a tidal reference. Full moons create spring tides, the highest and lowest tides of the month. If you're moving cargo by boat on the Thames, you need to account for tide tables. So Saturday night's full moon isn't mystical timing, it's practical, Watson said, the pieces clicking together in his mind. But, Holmes, why go to such elaborate lengths? Why not simply communicate these details directly? Holmes lit his pipe, this time with the deliberateness of a man preparing to deliver a lecture. Consider the social landscape of our time, Watson. London is the world's greatest port, the commercial heart of the British Empire. Fortunes are made and lost in those warehouses along the Thames. The Customs House employs hundreds of inspectors, and the Metropolitan Police patrol the docks constantly. How do you coordinate an enterprise that requires precise timing, specific locations, and multiple participants without creating evidence that could be intercepted? You disguise it as religious nonsense, Watson said slowly. Anyone intercepting the message sees occult ravings. Only those with the cipher key understand it's actually a shipping schedule. Precisely. And there's a certain elegance to it. Hide your criminal conspiracy in plain sight by making it look like exactly the sort of thing respectable society dismisses as the domain of cranks and mystics. The Victorian obsession with spiritualism provides perfect camouflage. Half of London attends séances on Tuesday evenings. Why would anyone take seriously yet another group spouting biblical prophecies? Holmes returned to his map, and Watson joined him, the two men standing shoulder to shoulder as they had countless times before, looking not at a representation of London, but at a puzzle, slowly surrendering its secrets. The city sprawled before them in ink and paper, the Thames snaking through its centre, the docks spreading along its banks, the warehouses and wharves, and all the commercial apparatus of empire rendered in careful cartography. "Here," Holmes said, pointing to a curve in the river just past Limehouse. "This is the river's bend mentioned in the letter. And here." His finger moved to a cluster of buildings marked in small print. "Is Warehouse 7 of the Meridian Trading Company. If I'm right, whatever our mysterious correspondents are planning will happen here on Saturday night during high tide." "Then we should inform Scotland Yard," Watson said, though he already knew what Holmes's response would be. "And tell them what? That we've decoded a mystical prophecy into a smuggling schedule. Lestrade is a good man, Watson, but his superiors require evidence, not theories, no matter how elegant. No, we need proof before we bring in the official forces. We need to understand the full scope of what we're dealing with." Holmes moved to the window, that restless energy that drove him apparent in every line of his body. Outside, afternoon was surrendering to evening, the lamplighters beginning their rounds, each gas lamp blooming into life like a small constellation being born. London was transforming, as it did every evening, the respectable day world giving way to something else, something less certain, where the boundaries between classes and purposes blurred in the forgiving darkness. "There's something else," Holmes said quietly. "Something that troubles me more than the smuggling itself. The letter was sent to me specifically, not to the police, not to the newspapers, but to me. That suggests either they want me to stop them, which makes no sense, or they want me to witness something, and I cannot fathom why a criminal enterprise would invite the attention of someone dedicated to unravelling their carefully constructed deceptions." Watson considered this, feeling the weight of it. Holmes was right. The invitation itself was the deepest mystery, the question that undermined every other certainty. Perhaps it's a trap? Perhaps? Or perhaps there are factions at work here, competing interests. One group executing the plan, another trying to expose it. That would explain the contradictions, the elaborate code that's meant to be broken, the religious theatre that's too theatrical to be entirely credible. The room had grown dark enough that Watson lit the lamp on the side table, its warm glow pushing back the shadows and creating that particular atmosphere of comfort and contemplation that Baker Street specialized in. Mrs. Hudson could be heard moving about downstairs, preparing dinner with the reassuring sounds of domesticity, the clatter of pots, the opening and closing of cupboards, the mundane music of daily life continuing regardless of mysteries and ciphers. Holmes turned from the window, his face half in shadow, half in lamplight, looking like a figure from a Renaissance painting, some philosopher or saint wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. "Watson, I need you to do something for me. Tomorrow, I want you to take yourself down to the docks. Dress as you would for a walking tour, nothing that marks you as a gentleman of leisure. Spend the day there, watching Warehouse 7. Note who comes and goes, what cargo is moved, anything that strikes you as unusual. And you? I have other inquiries to make. Our Meridian Trading Company. I want to know who owns it, who operates it, what legitimate business they conduct that might provide cover for less legitimate activities. There's a clerk at Company's House who owes me a favour from that business with the forged will last year. And I want to speak to some of my contacts in the criminal world, see if there's any whisper of a major operation planned. Watson nodded, already mentally preparing for a day among the docks. It wouldn't be the first time he'd played the role of observer in one of Holmes's investigations, and he'd learned over the years to blend into crowds, to watch without being watched, to notice details while appearing to notice nothing at all. It was a skill he'd developed in Afghanistan, actually, the ability to observe enemy positions without drawing attention, though he'd never expected to use it watching warehouses in East London. "There's one more element we need to consider," Holmes said, returning to the table and picking up the letter once more. "The first covenant ends, the second begins." That's not geographic code or tidal reference. That's something else, a suggestion of transition, of replacement. One system ending, another starting. "Perhaps they're simply switching smuggling routes," Watson offered. "Old methods being replaced by new ones?" "Possibly. Or, perhaps—" Holmes paused, his eyes narrowing as a thought struck him. "Watson, what if this isn't just about one shipment? What if the entire coded system, the biblical references, the mystical trappings, what if that's the covenant being discussed? The first covenant, perhaps, was a more straightforward operation, direct communication, simple coordination. But that system was compromised somehow, discovered or betrayed. So they're implementing a new covenant, a new system, this elaborate biblical cipher that can hide in plain sight among London's spiritualist enthusiasts." It made a terrible kind of sense, Watson had to admit. Victorian London was awash in occult societies, spiritualist circles, groups claiming special knowledge of hidden truths. The Society for Psychical Research had been founded just over a decade earlier, and séances were as common in fashionable drawing rooms as tea parties. A criminal organization using biblical codes could easily masquerade as yet another mystical society, their messages lost in the general noise of supernatural claims and prophetic pronouncements. "If you're right," Watson said slowly, "then Saturday night isn't just about one smuggling operation. It's a demonstration of the new system, a proof of concept, and by sending you the code, they're either incredibly confident in its security, or they're setting a trap of some kind," Holmes finished. "Which brings us back to the fundamental question. Why invite scrutiny from the one person in London most likely to see through their deception?" The clock on the mantel chimed 6, the sound clear and precise in the contemplative quiet of the room. Mrs. Hudson appeared at the door, announcing dinner with her usual efficiency, and the two men moved to the table, though Watson suspected neither would taste much of what they ate. Holmes's mind was clearly elsewhere, working through permutations and possibilities, testing theories against evidence in that extraordinary mental laboratory of his. They ate in companionable silence, the kind that only comes from years of shared experience. And Watson found himself thinking about London beyond their walls, that vast organism of humanity and ambition, of legitimate commerce and criminal enterprise existing side by side, sometimes indistinguishable from one another. The docks that would see them tomorrow were the arteries of empire, pumping goods and wealth through the British system. But like any living thing, the city had its infections, its parasites, its elements that fed on the whole while contributing nothing. After dinner, Holmes returned to his maps and schedules. But Watson could see his friend's energy was flagging slightly. That initial burst of discovery giving way to the patient, methodical work of verification and preparation. Watson took himself to his writing desk, ostensibly to catch up on correspondence, but actually to make notes on the case, a habit he'd developed early in their partnership, documenting Holmes's methods for what he'd vaguely planned might someday become published accounts. The evening deepened outside, London settling into its nighttime rhythms. The fog had returned, as Holmes had predicted, creeping through the streets like something sentient, wrapping the city in its familiar embrace. From somewhere distant came the sound of singing, a music hall letting out, probably, its patrons heading home with songs still on their lips and gin still warming their blood. "You know, Watson," Holmes said suddenly, not looking up from the shipping schedule he was studying, "there's a certain artistry to crime when it's done well. Not the brutish violence of the common thug, but this, the elaborate construction, the layering of meaning, the transformation of innocent elements into tools of deception. It's wrong, of course, and must be stopped, but one can appreciate the craftsmanship even while opposing the purpose." "You're saying you admire whoever designed this system?" "I'm saying I respect the intelligence behind it, which is different from admiration. A talented mind put this together, someone who understands Victorian society's blind spots, who recognizes how superstition can camouflage calculation, who knows that the best hiding place for a secret is often in plain view, disguised as something too ridiculous to take seriously." Holmes set down the schedule and looked at Watson directly, and there was something almost sad in his expression. "That's what troubles me most about this case. Whoever sent me that letter, whoever invited me to decode their cipher, they're not just intelligent. They understand how I think. They know I can't resist a puzzle, that I'll dedicate myself to solving it, regardless of the consequences. In a way, they know me better than I might wish." Watson had no response to that, no comfort to offer against the peculiar loneliness of being understood by an enemy, of having one's own nature weaponized against oneself. Instead, he simply nodded, and the two men returned to their respective tasks. Holmes to his evidence, Watson to his notes, while London continued its endless conversation with itself outside their window. A million stories unfolding in the darkness, most of them destined to remain forever unknown. The night wore on, the fire burned lower, and eventually even Holmes's formidable energy required rest. They retired to their rooms with the unspoken agreement that tomorrow would bring new discoveries, new challenges, new pieces of the puzzle that was slowly revealing itself beneath the surface of Victorian respectability. Watson lay in his bed, listening to the familiar sounds of the building settling, Mrs. Hudson's footsteps on the floor below, the distant rumble of a late cab passing in the street. He thought about the docks he would visit tomorrow, about Warehouse 7 and whatever secrets it held, about full moons and high tides, and the peculiar grammar of devils who spoke in biblical verses while planning decidedly earthly crimes. Sleep came eventually, as it always did, though his dreams were troubled by images of glass palaces and dark warehouses, of codes written in scripture and secrets hidden in plain sight, of a city that was both entirely familiar and completely unknown, depending on which shadows you chose to explore. In his own room, Holmes remained awake longer, standing at his window and looking out at the fog-wrapped streets, his mind working through the case from every angle, testing each theory against the available facts, trying to see the shape of something that remained frustratingly just beyond the edge of understanding. Saturday was coming, with its full moon and its promises, and somewhere in London, people were preparing for whatever the devil's cipher had encoded in its borrowed prophecies. The beast would swim up the Thames with the tide, glass and iron would meet sky under the moon's witness, and 7 seals, or perhaps 7 warehouses, would play their part in a drama that was both ancient in its methods and entirely modern in its execution. The city slept, or pretended to, while beneath its surface, mysteries continued their patient work of complicating certainties and challenging assumptions. And in that space, between day and night, between knowledge and ignorance, between the London that appeared on maps and the London that existed in shadows, the truth waited to be discovered by those brave or foolish enough to seek it. Morning tea at Baker Street possessed a ritual quality that Watson had come to cherish. The precise arrangement of cups and saucer, the particular angle at which Mrs. Hudson poured, the comfortable silence that accompanied the first sip of the day. But this morning, the ritual felt weighted with anticipation, as if the tea itself knew that the day ahead would require more than usual from those who drank it. Holmes sat across from Watson, freshly shaved and impeccably dressed in the clothes of a respectable gentleman about to make business calls, though Watson knew the true nature of his friend's errands would be considerably less conventional than appearances suggested. Between them, the morning papers lay scattered. The Times, the Telegraph, the Morning Post, each one scanned by Holmes with that peculiar intensity that could extract meaning from what others dismissed as filler. "Nothing," Holmes murmured, setting down the Telegraph with evident disappointment. Not a whisper about the Crystal Palace incident, no reports of unusual activity at the docks, no mention of mysterious societies or biblical prophecies. Either our conspirators are operating well below the threshold of journalistic interest, or they've been remarkably successful at keeping their activities quiet. Watson spread marmalade on his toast with the careful precision of a man trying to maintain normalcy in the face of mounting intrigue. Perhaps that's the point of their elaborate system, to remain invisible until the moment they choose to be seen. Quite so. Though invisibility in London requires considerable effort, this city talks to itself constantly. Servants gossip, clerks complain, dock workers share rumours over pints. The fact that we've heard nothing suggests either remarkable discipline or a very small operation. I'm inclined toward the former, which makes it all the more concerning. Holmes consulted his pocket watch, a gesture Watson recognized as marking the transition from contemplation to action. "You'll head to the docks after breakfast? I've prepared a letter of introduction, should you need it. You're a representative of a textile merchant looking to secure warehouse space. It should give you reason to observe Warehouse 7 without arousing suspicion. And you. I have an appointment at Company's House at 10, followed by a visit to an old acquaintance in Limehouse, who keeps his finger rather precisely on the pulse of Thames commerce, both legal and otherwise. If there's something significant planned for Saturday night, he'll know of it. though extracting the information may require a certain delicacy. Watson nodded, recognizing that delicacy in Holmes's vocabulary often meant negotiations he'd rather Watson not witness. His friend's network of informants spanned every level of London society, from drawing rooms to opium dens, and the methods by which he maintained those relationships were sometimes better left unexamined. They finished breakfast in comfortable silence, each man preparing mentally for his respective tasks, and it struck Watson, not for the first time, how much their partnership had evolved into a kind of shorthand, where entire conversations could be conducted through glances and gestures, where trust had rendered explicit instruction largely unnecessary. The day beyond their windows promised to be clearer than those previous. The fog had lifted enough to reveal weak November sunshine, attempting to warm the city's stones. Watson could see it painting the buildings across the street in shades of honey and amber, transforming Baker Street into something almost Mediterranean, though the illusion would last only until clouds reasserted their dominance, as they inevitably would. By 9 o'clock, Watson found himself in a hansom cab heading east, watching London transform through the window as surely as if he were travelling through different countries rather than different neighbourhoods. The respectable terraces of Marylebone gave way to the commercial bustle of the city, which in turn surrendered to the industrial reality of the East End, where the Empire's commercial machinery operated without pretense or apology. The docks, when he reached them, were a world unto themselves, a forest of masts and rigging, of cranes and warehouses, of sounds and smells that spoke of everywhere and nowhere simultaneously. The air tasted of salt and tar and coal smoke, of spices from India and tobacco from America, of all the world's goods passing through this one point on the Thames. The noise was constant, the shouts of foremen, the creak of winches, the splash of water against hulls, the rumble of carts on cobblestones, creating a symphony of commerce that never quite reached harmony, but somehow maintained its own compelling rhythm. Watson presented himself at the harbour-master's office with the letter Holmes had prepared, adopting the slightly deferential manner of a man representing interests larger than himself. The clerk who received him was young, harried, and clearly more interested in returning to his ledgers than in entertaining inquiries about warehouse space. But he grudgingly agreed to provide directions to the Meridian Trading Company's facilities. Warehouse 7 sat at the eastern edge of the company's holdings, a substantial brick structure that backed directly onto the Thames, with its own small dock for loading and unloading cargo. From the outside, it appeared no different from dozens of similar buildings lining the river. 4 stories of practical architecture, small windows set high in the walls, large doors designed to accommodate the movement of goods rather than people. Watson positioned himself at a respectable distance, in a small courtyard between 2 other warehouses where several dock workers sat taking their morning break. He purchased a cup of tea from a vendor's cart, weak stuff that tasted more of the Thames than of actual tea leaves, and settled in to observe, adopting the vacant expression of a man with time to waste and nowhere particular to be. The morning passed slowly, measured in the loading and unloading of carts, in the comings and goings of clerks and foremen, in the 1,000 small transactions that kept the machinery of commerce operating. Watson watched Warehouse 7 with the patient attention Holmes had taught him, noting who entered and who left, what cargo moved in and out, the rhythms and patterns that revealed themselves only to sustained observation. What he saw appeared entirely ordinary, bales of cotton being unloaded from one wagon, crates marked with customs, seals being loaded onto another, clerks checking manifests with the bored efficiency of men performing familiar tasks. If there was anything criminal occurring here, it was hidden beneath layers of legitimate business, so convincing that Watson began to doubt his and Holmes' theories. But then, around midday, something changed. A carriage arrived. Not the utilitarian wagons that had been coming and going all morning, but a private carriage of the sort that suggested wealth without advertising it too loudly. Man emerged, middle-aged and respectably dressed, carrying himself with the particular assurance that comes from either genuine authority or excellent performance of same. What caught Watson's attention, however, wasn't the man himself, but the reaction his arrival produced. The casual atmosphere around the warehouse shifted subtly. Workers who had been moving at the standard pace of employed labour suddenly found additional energy. The foreman who had been lounging against the building straightened and approached the visitor with clear deference, and the general air of bored routine transformed into something more alert, more purposeful. The visitor entered the warehouse, and Watson noted the time, 12:15. He remained inside for approximately 40 minutes, during which the normal flow of work seemed to pause, as if whatever was being discussed within required privacy from even the regular employees. When the man emerged, he was accompanied by another figure, and this one made Watson sit up straighter despite himself. It was a woman, perhaps 30 years old, dressed in the dark, modest clothing of a respectable middle-class widow, or perhaps a governess. But there was something in her bearing that didn't quite match the humility her clothes suggested, a directness in her gaze, a confidence in her movement that spoke of someone accustomed to being listened to rather than overlooked. They spoke briefly at the warehouse entrance, too far away for Watson to hear their words, but he could see the intensity of their exchange, the way the man gestured emphatically, while the woman listened with perfect stillness. Then she nodded once, decisively, and departed in the same carriage that had brought the man, leaving him standing at the warehouse entrance, looking after her with an expression Watson couldn't quite interpret. The man remained outside for a moment longer, and Watson seized the opportunity, rising from his position and approaching with the air of someone seeking directions. "Pardon me," he said, affecting a slight Yorkshire accent he'd cultivated for just such purposes. "I'm looking for the offices of Harrison and Sons, textile merchants. Was told they were somewhere along this stretch." The man turned, and Watson found himself looking into a face that was handsome in a conventional way, well-maintained, but unremarkable. The sort of face that would be difficult to describe from memory because it possessed no distinguishing characteristics. But the eyes were sharp, assessing, calculating the nature and potential threat of this interruption before responding. "Harrison and Sons?" the man said, his voice cultured, educated, carrying the slight nasal quality of someone who'd learned to speak properly rather than being born to it. "I'm afraid I don't know them. You might try asking at the harbour master's office. They keep directories of all the businesses operating along the docks." "Much obliged," Watson said, preparing to move on. But the man wasn't quite finished. "Are you new to the area?" he asked, the question casual, but the attention behind it anything but. Only I don't recognize you, and I know most of the merchants who work these docks." Watson felt the weight of scrutiny, and understood that this was a test, that his answer would determine whether he remained an innocent bystander or graduated to something more concerning in this man's estimation. "First time down here on business," he said, allowing a touch of nervousness to enter his voice. "Usually deal with the warehouses in Wapping, but they're full up this month. Expanding operations, see? And need additional space." The man's expression softened slightly, though his eyes remained watchful. "Well, good luck to you. It's competitive territory, this stretch of the Thames. The established firms don't take kindly to newcomers trying to muscle in on their arrangements." There was something in the phrasing, "their arrangements," that carried weight beyond the obvious meaning, a suggestion of territories and agreements that went beyond simple business competition. Watson nodded deferentially and moved off, feeling the man's gaze on his back until he turned the corner and left Warehouse 7 behind. He found a different vantage point for the afternoon, a narrow alley between two buildings that offered a partially obscured view of the warehouse entrance. The weak sunshine had surrendered entirely now to clouds that promised rain by evening, and the temperature was dropping with the particular damp cold that London specialized in, the kind that penetrated coats and settled into bones with patient malevolence. The afternoon brought different visitors. A priest in traditional cassock and collar who entered carrying what appeared to be a leather portfolio. 2 men who might have been clerks, or might have been something else entirely. And, most intriguingly, the woman from earlier, returning without the carriage this time, arriving on foot and entering the warehouse with the purposeful stride of someone who belonged there. Watson maintained his watch until the early winter dusk began to fall, until the lamplighters started their rounds and the character of the docks shifted from day work to night work, until his feet ached and his hands had gone numb despite his gloves. Only then did he abandon his position, heading back toward the city centre with a notebook full of observations, and a growing sense that Holmes's theories about Warehouse 7 were considerably more than mere speculation. He arrived back at Baker Street to find Holmes already returned, sprawled in his chair with the boneless grace of a cat, surrounded by papers and smoking his pipe with evident satisfaction. The sitting room smelled of tobacco and the chemical traces of whatever experiments Holmes had been conducting earlier, creating an atmosphere that was both comforting and slightly concerning. "Watson," Holmes said, sitting up with energy that suggested important discoveries. "Excellent timing. I trust your day at the docks was illuminating." Watson removed his coat and settled into his chair, accepting the whiskey Holmes had already poured with the gratitude of a man who'd spent hours in the cold. "I saw several interesting visitors to Warehouse 7. One in particular, a man, well-dressed, clearly in some position of authority over the operation, and a woman, surprisingly enough, who seemed to be involved at a significant level." "A woman?" Holmes leaned forward, interest sharpening his features. "Describe her." Watson did so, and watched Holmes's expression shift from interest to something like recognition. "Yes," the detective murmured. "Yes, that fits. Watson, I spent my afternoon learning some very interesting things about the Meridian Trading Company and its owners. The company is legitimate, or at least it conducts significant legitimate business. But it's owned by a consortium of investors, and buried in the paperwork is a name that struck me as familiar. Cornelius Blackwood. Should I know that name? Perhaps not. but I do. 3 years ago there was a case, minor, really, which is why it never made your published accounts. A vicar in Suffolk reported that several valuable items had gone missing from his church. Not theft, precisely, because they were given voluntarily. Donated, he said, by parishioners who claimed they were fulfilling religious obligations. But the vicar was suspicious because the donations came all at once, from people who'd never shown particular religious fervour, and because they included some rather specific items: old manuscripts, church records, objects with historical value rather than monetary worth. Holmes paused to relight his pipe, and Watson waited, recognizing the cadence of a story being carefully constructed. I investigated briefly, but the trail went cold. The items had vanished into London's sprawling antiques trade, impossible to trace. But I did learn that the parishioners had all been attending meetings of a new religious society, the Brotherhood of the Second Covenant, they called themselves. And the man who founded that society, who led their services and collected their donations, was named Cornelius Blackwood. And you think this is the same man? I know it is. My friend in Limehouse confirmed it this afternoon. Blackwood has been quietly operating in the East End for years, running what appears to be a legitimate trading company while simultaneously cultivating a following among those seeking spiritual meaning in an increasingly industrial age. He preaches a particular theology, the idea that the old covenant, the old ways are ending, and that a new dispensation is beginning. Those who follow him, who contribute to his cause, will be elevated in this new order. Watson felt pieces clicking together, patterns emerging from what had seemed like random observations. So he's using religious belief to manipulate people into supporting his criminal activities. More subtle than that, I think. Based on what I learned today, Blackwood has 2 distinct operations running simultaneously. One is the criminal enterprise, the smuggling, the trafficking of stolen goods, all disguised within the legitimate activities of his trading company. But the other is genuine, in its way. He really has created a religious movement, really does have followers who believe in his teachings. The question is whether he believes them himself, or whether it's all theatre designed to provide cover and recruitment for his less legal activities. Holmes stood and moved to the map on the wall, his finger tracing the route along the Thames they'd identified earlier. The woman you saw, I believe that's Margaret Ashwood, Blackwood's second in command, though whether in the spiritual or criminal branch of his enterprise, I couldn't determine. She's been with him from the beginning, apparently. Some say she's a true believer, some say she's the practical mind behind his operation. Likely she's both. Then Saturday night is both a criminal operation and a religious ceremony, layered together so thoroughly that even the participants may not know which they're engaged in. The true believers will think they're attending a ritual to inaugurate the new covenant. The criminals will know they're coordinating a smuggling operation, and Blackwood and Ashwood will orchestrate both simultaneously, each group serving the purposes of the other, without necessarily understanding the full picture. Watson absorbed this, trying to imagine the complexity of maintaining such a dual structure, the constant balancing act between genuine faith and calculated exploitation. It's monstrous, he said quietly, to take people's sincere beliefs and manipulate them toward criminal ends. It's human, Holmes corrected, though there was no warmth in his voice. People have been doing it for millennia. Every revolution, every religious movement, every social transformation. They all attract both genuine believers and opportunistic parasites. Blackwood has simply formalized the arrangement, created a system where faith and felony can coexist symbiotically. The room had grown dark while they talked, the fire burning low, and Mrs. Hudson appeared to light the lamps and announce dinner, her presence a welcome reminder that the world continued its normal operation despite mysteries and conspiracies. They ate mechanically, both men too engaged in contemplation to pay much attention to the food, and afterward returned to the sitting room to plan their next moves. "I want to meet one of them," Holmes said suddenly. "One of Blackwood's true believers. I need to understand what he's offering them, what appeal his theology holds that would make reasonable people participate in activities that skirt or cross the boundaries of legality. And how do you propose to arrange such a meeting?" Holmes smiled. There was something mischievous in it. "My contact in Limehouse provided an address, a meeting house where Blackwood's Brotherhood gathers on Thursday evenings. Tomorrow night, Watson, you and I are going to attend a service. We're going to see firsthand what the Second Covenant promises to those who believe in it." Watson felt a mix of apprehension and curiosity. "Will be recognized, surely, if Blackwood is as careful as you suggest. We'll go as seekers, Watson, spiritual pilgrims looking for meaning in a confusing age. It's not far from the truth in some ways. And if we're lucky, we'll learn not just what Blackwood is planning for Saturday night, but why. Why go to such elaborate lengths? Why risk exposure by sending me that letter? Why build an entire theology around what could be accomplished with simple criminal organization?" Outside, night had claimed London completely, the gas lamps creating pools of light in the darkness, the fog returning with renewed determination. Watson stood at the window, looking out at the city they'd sworn to protect, and wondered about the people out there. How many were true believers in something? How many were being manipulated? How many were doing the manipulating? And how many, like him and Holmes, were simply trying to navigate between those extremes, seeking truth in a world that seemed increasingly designed to obscure it? "Thursday, then," Watson said, turning from the window. "We'll see what promises the Brotherhood makes to its followers." Holmes nodded, already making notes, already planning, always planning. And somewhere in the East End, in Warehouse 7, or in the Meeting House, or in whatever other spaces Blackwood's dual enterprise occupied, people were preparing for Saturday night, some praying, some plotting, some possibly doing both, while the Thames flowed on, indifferent to the purposes to which humans bent its currents, carrying commerce and secrets in equal measure toward the sea. Thursday evening arrived wrapped in fog so thick it seemed less like weather and more like intention, as if London itself had decided to obscure what was about to unfold. Holmes and Watson stood in Baker Street, preparing for their expedition with the care of actors about to take the stage, adjusting their costumes, which is to say their clothing, to suggest men of modest means seeking spiritual guidance rather than detective and doctor on an investigation. Holmes had exchanged his usual impeccable attire for something more worn, a jacket with slightly frayed cuffs and trousers that had seen better days, but remained respectable enough for a clerk or shopkeeper. Watson had done similarly, both men transforming themselves through subtle alterations of posture and expression into versions of themselves that might believably seek the comfort of religious fellowship in the East End's labyrinth of faith and commerce. "Remember," Holmes said as they prepared to depart, "we're seeking meaning. We've heard, of the brotherhood through a friend, and we're curious about this new covenant they preach. We ask questions, but gently. We show interest without skepticism. The goal is to understand, not to interrogate. Watson nodded, checking that his notebook was secure in his inner pocket. Mrs. Hudson had packed them sandwiches for the journey, treating their evening excursion with the same maternal efficiency she brought to all their adventures, as if attending a potentially criminal religious meeting was no different from a country outing. The journey east took them through London's evening transformation, that nightly metamorphosis where the city shed its daytime respectability and revealed something more complex beneath. The West End's theatres were lighting up, their marquees bright against the darkness, while in the financial district the last clerks hurried home past buildings that had gone dark and silent. Further east, the neighbourhoods grew denser, the streets narrower, the buildings leaning toward each other as if sharing secrets the broader avenues would never hear. They took the underground to Aldgate, that marvel of Victorian engineering that had transformed London into something three-dimensional, adding depth to a city that had always sprawled horizontally. The tunnels were warm with the press of humanity, the air thick with the smell of coal smoke and wet wool, and the particular anxiety of enclosed spaces. Watson watched his fellow passengers with the anthropologist's eye Holmes had taught him to cultivate, seeing in their faces the 1,000 different Londons they each inhabited, the city of the charwoman heading to her night shift, the city of the young clerk courting on a meagre salary, the city of the tradesman returning from delivering goods, each as real as the London of Baker Street, but infinitely more precarious. Emerging at Aldgate was like surfacing from water, the air suddenly fresher despite the fog, the space expanding after the tunnel's constriction. They walked east from there, deeper into territory where gas lamps grew sparser and the spaces between them darker, where the Thames made its presence known not through sight, but through smell and sound, the river's patient movement beneath the city's clamour. The meeting house, when they found it, was tucked between a chandler's shop and a boarding house in a narrow street that barely merited a name. It had once been something else, a warehouse perhaps, or a small manufactory, and its conversion to religious use had been accomplished with more enthusiasm than resources. The windows had been covered with cheap stained glass that attempted to suggest sanctity, and above the door someone had painted Brotherhood of the Second Covenant, in letters that aspired to Gothic elegance, but achieved only earnest awkwardness. Light spilled from the windows, and they could hear singing from within. Voices raised in a hymn Watson didn't recognize, the melody unfamiliar, but the fervour unmistakable. Holmes paused at the door, his hand on the latch, and for a moment Watson saw something complicated in his friend's expression. Anticipation, certainly, but also a kind of sadness, as if what they were about to witness pained him even before he'd seen it. They entered to find perhaps 30 people, gathered in a space that might comfortably hold 20. The interior had been arranged to suggest a church. Rough benches facing a raised platform where a pulpit stood, candles providing light that was more atmospheric than practical, the walls bare except for a single symbol painted above the platform. A circle divided into 7 segments, each segment containing a different biblical scene, rendered in the same earnest, amateur style as the sign outside. The congregation, for that's what they were, Watson realized, genuine worshippers rather than criminal conspirators, at least in their own understanding, was diverse in age, but uniform in apparent social class. These were working people, the faces weathered by labor and worry, the clothes clean but mended, the hands showing the calluses of those who earned their living through physical effort. A few turned as Holmes and Watson entered, curiosity without hostility in their gazes, and an older woman near the back gestured to empty spaces on the bench beside her. The hymn concluded, and the congregation settled into expectant silence. Then, from a door behind the platform, Cornelius Blackwood emerged, and Watson felt the atmosphere in the room shift, attention focusing with almost physical force on the figure now taking position behind the pulpit. Blackwood was perhaps 45, handsome in a way that had weathered well, his dark hair touched with distinguished grey at the temples, his bearing suggesting education and authority without arrogance. He wore simple, dark clothes, not quite clerical, but suggesting that direction, and when he smiled at his congregation, Watson saw genuine warmth there, or at least an excellent performance of it. "Brothers and sisters," Blackwood began, his voice rich and resonant, trained to fill spaces without shouting. "Welcome to this gathering of those who see. Welcome to those who understand that the old ways are ending, that a new dispensation is upon us, that we stand at the threshold of transformation." Watson glanced at Holmes, seeing his friend's face perfectly composed in an expression of interested attention, revealing nothing of the detective's true purpose. Around them, the congregation leaned forward slightly, drawn by Blackwood's words like plants toward sunlight. "The world tells us that we are powerless," Blackwood continued, beginning to pace the small platform with controlled energy. "It tells us that our labor is meaningless, that our lives are small, that the great changes of our age are beyond our influence or understanding. The factories rise, the machines multiply, the old certainties crumble, and we are told to simply endure, to accept, to labor without question for wages that grow smaller as the fortunes of others grow larger." Nods from the congregation, murmurs of agreement. Watson recognized the rhetoric. It was the language of every social reform movement, every religious awakening, every attempt to give meaning to lives that industrial capitalism had rendered mechanical. The words themselves were neither unique nor particularly radical, but Blackwood delivered them with conviction that made them feel personal, directed at each listener individually. "But I tell you that this is the lie," Blackwood said, his voice rising slightly. "The lie is that you are powerless. The truth, the hidden truth that the old powers fear, is that transformation is coming, and you are its instruments, not through violence, not through politics, but through understanding, through seeing what others refuse to see, through accepting your role in the new covenant that is even now being written." He paused, letting the words settle, and Watson saw how effectively he'd captured his audience. These were people hungry for significance, for the assurance that their lives mattered in some cosmic sense, that their struggles served a purpose beyond mere survival. Blackwood was offering them exactly what they craved: importance, agency, the promise that they were special, chosen, significant. "The old covenant," Blackwood continued, his voice dropping to something more intimate, "was between God and man, sealed in blood and sacrifice. But that covenant has run its course. The old symbols have lost their power. The old rituals have become empty performance. We stand now at the ending of one age and the beginning of another, and those who see, who truly see, will be elevated in the new order that is coming. Watson felt Holmes shift slightly beside him, and recognized it as his friends tell when something particularly interesting had been revealed. The language Blackwood was using. The old covenant. The new order. It echoed the mysterious letter. But hearing it in context, Watson understood it was more than criminal code. Blackwood genuinely believed in this theology, or had convinced himself so thoroughly that belief and performance had become indistinguishable. "This Saturday," Blackwood said, and Watson's attention sharpened, "we will gather for a ceremony that will mark the transition. 7 seals will be opened. 7 mysteries will be revealed. The old order will symbolically end, and the new will begin. Not in some distant heaven, not in some abstract future, but here, now, in this city, in your lives." The congregation stirred with excitement, whispered conversations breaking out briefly before Blackwood raised his hand for silence. "I know that some of you have questions, that some wonder whether these are merely symbols or whether something real will transpire. I tell you, what happens Saturday night will be both. The spiritual and the material are not separate, despite what the old religions teach. They are intertwined, each giving meaning to the other. What we do in the physical realm echoes in the spiritual, and what we accomplish spiritually manifests in the material world." It was, Watson realized, a theology perfectly designed to justify questionable actions. If the spiritual and material were truly unified in the way Blackwood suggested, then smuggling goods could be reframed as spiritual work, criminal enterprise could become religious practice, and those participating would believe themselves to be serving higher purposes even as they broke earthly laws. Margaret Ashwood emerged then from the same door Blackwood had used, and Watson recognized her from his observations at the warehouse. She carried a wooden box, simple but well made, which she placed on a small table beside the pulpit. Blackwood opened it reverently, and even from their position in the back, Watson could see it contained small objects, tokens or symbols of some kind. "For those who have committed themselves to the new covenant," Blackwood said, "who have contributed their resources and their faith to our common purpose, Margaret will distribute these seals. They will mark you as initiates, as those who will be present Saturday when the transformation begins. Come forward if you have fulfilled your obligations. Come forward if you are ready to witness." About half the congregation rose and formed a line, moving towards the platform with expressions of mingled pride and reverence. Watson watched them receive their tokens, small metal discs he saw as people returned past them, stamped with that same 7-segmented circle that adorned the wall. They were, he realized, admission tokens, the kind that legitimate organizations used to control access to events or meetings. Blackwood was maintaining the structure of criminal organization while draping it in religious significance. Those who remained seated, like Holmes and Watson, watched the distribution with varying degrees of emotion. Some looked envious, clearly wishing they'd qualified to receive the tokens. Others appeared uncertain, perhaps questioning whether they'd made the right choice in holding back resources. A few seemed genuinely confused, as if they'd expected something different from the evening service. After the distribution, Blackwood led them in another hymn, and then the service concluded with remarkable abruptness. "Go in peace," Blackwood said, "and prepare your hearts for Saturday. The old age is ending, the new is about to begin. You who have eyes to see and ears to hear, be ready." The congregation dispersed slowly, clustering in small groups to discuss what they'd heard, some approaching Blackwood or Ashwood directly with questions or requests. Holmes caught Watson's eye and made a subtle gesture. They would remain, would attempt to speak with Blackwood themselves, would play out their roles as seekers to whatever conclusion presented itself. They waited until the crowd had thinned, until only a handful of stragglers remained, and then Holmes approached the platform, where Blackwood stood in quiet conversation with Margaret Ashwood. Watson followed, adopting the slightly deferential posture of someone uncertain of their welcome. "Mr. Blackwood," Holmes said, his voice carrying none of its usual crisp authority, instead softened into something more hesitant. "Forgive the intrusion. My friend and I were new to the area, and we heard about your brotherhood from a colleague at the docks. We were curious, so we came this evening. What you said, it resonates somehow. This sense that the world is changing, that the old certainties no longer hold." Blackwood turned, and Watson saw assessment in his eyes. Rapid, calculating, the same quality he'd seen in the man at the warehouse, though Blackwood disguised it better beneath pastoral warmth. "Welcome, brothers," he said, extending his hand first to Holmes, then to Watson. "Any who seek understanding are welcome here. These are uncertain times, are they not? The old world dying, the new not yet born, and in the gap between, so much confusion, so much fear." "Your colleague mentioned you work at the docks," Margaret Ashwood interjected, her voice pleasant, but her attention sharp. "Which company?" Watson felt the moment's danger. They were being tested, evaluated for authenticity. Holmes had prepared them for this, but the success of their deception would depend on details, on the 1,000 small elements that separated truth from performance. "I'm a clerk with Patterson and Sons," Watson heard himself say, naming a company Holmes had researched as legitimate, but small enough that a clerk there might not be widely known. "My friend here works in similar capacity at a textile warehouse in Southwark. We met through mutual acquaintances, discovered we shared similar questions about life, about purpose. Questions we haven't found answers to in traditional churches," Holmes added, with just the right note of frustrated seeking. "The old sermons seem disconnected from our daily reality. They speak of heaven and hell. But what about the heaven and hell we live in now? What about meaning in the midst of industrial machinery and social transformation?" Blackwood's expression shifted towards something that might have been genuine sympathy, and Watson wondered if perhaps the man's belief was more authentic than they'd credited. "Exactly," Blackwood said. "Exactly right. The old religions were formed in agricultural societies, in worlds where change came slowly. They cannot speak to our age of steam and electricity, of cities that remake themselves every generation. We need a new understanding, a new covenant that addresses the world as it actually is, not as it was or as we wish it might be." "This ceremony on Saturday," Holmes said carefully, "the one you mentioned, is it something we might attend, even though we haven't yet contributed, haven't yet fully committed?" Margaret Ashwood and Blackwood exchanged a glance, some silent communication passing between them. "The ceremony itself is for initiates only," Ashwood said, her tone apologetic but firm. "Those who've demonstrated their commitment through contribution and service. However," she paused, seeming to consider, If you're genuinely interested in joining our brotherhood, in committing to the new covenant, there are ways to accelerate the process. We meet here again tomorrow evening, Blackwood added. A smaller gathering, more intimate. Come then, and we'll discuss what commitment means, what the new covenant requires. If you're sincere in your seeking, and I believe you are, then perhaps arrangements can be made for Saturday. It was, Watson realized, both an invitation and a test. They were being offered accelerated access in exchange for something. Money, certainly, but perhaps also information, proof of authenticity, verification that they were who they claimed to be. "We'll come," Holmes said, and Watson heard the careful balance in his friend's voice, eager enough to seem genuine, but not so eager as to raise suspicion. "Tomorrow evening, then. And perhaps between now and then you might help me understand something. You speak of 7 seals, of mysteries being revealed. I've read my Bible. Revelation speaks of such things. But what does it mean in practical terms? What are we actually discussing?" Blackwood smiled, and there was something pleased in it, as if Holmes had asked exactly the right question. "Come tomorrow," he said, "and I'll explain. The 7 seals are both symbol and reality, both ancient mystery and modern truth. Understanding requires patience, and patience requires commitment. But for those willing to journey with open minds and faithful hearts, the revelation is profound." They took their leave shortly after, stepping back into the fog-wrapped street with nods and pleasantries that maintained their performance until distance and darkness made such pretense unnecessary. Holmes set a brisk pace heading west, saying nothing until they'd put considerable space between themselves and the meeting house. "Well," Watson said finally, when they'd reached a broader street, where other pedestrians provided cover. That was illuminating. Blackwood is either a true believer who's rationalized criminal activity as spiritual work, or he's the most accomplished actor I've encountered outside the professional theatre. "Both, I think," Holmes replied, his voice returning to its normal timbre. "The best deceivers are those who've convinced themselves that their lies are truth. Blackwood has created a theology that serves his purposes so perfectly because he genuinely believes in its core premises. The manipulation isn't conscious cynicism, it's unconscious justification." They walked in silence for a time, the fog transforming London into something dreamlike, buildings appearing and disappearing like memories, the city becoming a maze, where every turning looked the same and landmarks vanished into white obscurity. Watson found himself thinking about the people they'd seen in that meeting house. Working men and women seeking meaning in lives that industrial society had rendered mechanical and precarious. They weren't fools or criminals. They were people trying to find significance in circumstances that offered them precious little. "The ceremony Saturday," Watson said. "It will happen at Warehouse 7? "Almost certainly. The symbolism requires water. Blackwood's theology speaks of transitions, of passages between states. The Thames serves both practical and symbolic purposes. The warehouse allows him to conduct legitimate business while simultaneously hosting his spiritual theatre. And the timing, the full moon, the high tide, adds natural drama to what he's orchestrated. Should we inform Scotland Yard now? We have enough to justify investigation, surely." Holmes was quiet for a long moment, and Watson recognized it as his friend wrestling with competing imperatives. "Not yet," he said finally. "We still don't know the full scope of what's planned. If we bring in the police prematurely, we may stop one shipment, but leave the larger operation intact. Blackwood would simply reorganize, create a new system, recruit new followers. No, we need to understand everything, the full network, the complete operation. Tomorrow's meeting should provide that understanding. They emerged from the East End's labyrinth into areas Watson recognized, the city resolving itself back into familiar geography. A late omnibus rumbled past, its few passengers looking exhausted beneath the interior lamps. A pub was closing, its last customers spilling into the street with the careful dignity of men determined not to appear drunk, despite overwhelming evidence to the contrary. "There's something else," Holmes said quietly. "Something that troubles me more than the criminal enterprise or the spiritual manipulation. Did you notice how many children were present this evening? Not many, but some. Families are involved in this, Watson. Blackwood isn't just recruiting individuals. He's cultivating generational loyalty. That makes it more complex, more difficult to simply dismantle." Watson had noticed the children, a few infants in their mother's arms, some older ones sitting with the patience of those accustomed to adult proceedings. It added another layer of concern to an already troubling situation. These weren't hardened criminals making calculated choices. These were families seeking community, stability, meaning, in an age that seemed designed to deny all three. They found a cab eventually and rode back to Baker Street in contemplative silence, each man processing what they'd witnessed, trying to fit it into the larger puzzle they'd been assembling since that first letter arrived. Mrs. Hudson had left the fire banked and tea prepared, bless her, and they settled into their chairs with the gratitude of men returning to sanctuary after venturing into uncertain territory. "Tomorrow," Holmes said, accepting the whiskey Watson poured, "we'll learn what Blackwood requires for accelerated initiation. It will be expensive. Men like him always price their mysteries high enough to seem valuable. We'll pay it, of course. And in exchange, we'll gain access to Saturday's ceremony, to the full revelation of what he's actually planning. And then we'll have our evidence. We'll understand the scope and mechanics of his operation. And we'll have to make some difficult decisions about how to proceed, knowing that stopping Blackwood means disrupting the lives of people who genuinely believe he's offering them salvation." Watson stared into his whiskey, seeing in its amber depths the complexity of their situation. They could expose Blackwood's criminal activities, certainly. They could bring down his smuggling operation, disrupt his exploitation of religious faith for illegal purposes. But they couldn't simply arrest away the needs that had driven people to seek meaning in his brotherhood, couldn't legislate solutions to the poverty and precariousness that made Blackwood's promises appealing in the first place. "Sometimes," Watson said quietly, "I wonder if we're merely treating symptoms rather than causes. We stop individual criminals, solve particular cases, but the conditions that create them remain unchanged." Holmes looked at him with something that might have been respect or might have been shared melancholy. "We do what we can, Watson. We solve the puzzles set before us. Larger transformations, social reform, economic justice, the restructuring of society itself, those are beyond our purview. But perhaps in solving these individual cases, in pursuing these particular truths, we contribute in some small way to the larger work others are doing. Or at least, that's what I tell myself on the nights when the limitations of our endeavour feel most pressing." The fire burned lower, the room growing dimmer, and outside, London settled into its deepest nighttime quiet. that brief period between the last revellers heading home and the first workers beginning their days. Somewhere in the city, Cornelius Blackwood was perhaps preparing for tomorrow's meeting. Margaret Ashwood was perhaps organising Saturday's ceremony, and 30-odd souls were perhaps sleeping more peacefully for having attended that evening's service, unaware that the covenant they'd embraced was about to be unsealed by forces they'd never anticipated. Watson eventually retired to his room, though sleep came slowly, his mind replaying the evening scenes, the fervour in that cramped meeting-house, the skill with which Blackwood had woven together spiritual longing and practical manipulation, the faces of people seeking meaning in circumstances that offered them precious little. He thought about Saturday, about whatever revelation awaited at Warehouse 7, about the full moon that would rise over the Thames to illuminate both crime and ceremony. And he wondered whether understanding would bring clarity, or merely reveal how much more complicated everything was than they'd imagined. In his own room, Holmes remained awake even longer, standing at his window and looking out at fog-shrouded Baker Street, his mind mapping the connections they'd discovered, anticipating the ones still hidden, preparing for tomorrow's negotiations and Saturday's denouement. The devil's cipher was beginning to reveal its grammar, but Holmes suspected that understanding the language was only the beginning. Knowing what it said was a separate matter entirely, and knowing what to do with that knowledge might prove the most difficult challenge of all. Friday evening arrived with a cold that seemed to seep up from the Thames itself, penetrating clothes and settling into bones with the patient malevolence of a London November. Holmes and Watson made their way east once more, this time carrying a leather satchel containing £50, an amount Holmes had deemed sufficient to demonstrate serious intent, without appearing suspiciously wealthy for men of their supposed station. The money represented a calculated risk, Watson knew. It was bait in a trap, but traps had an unfortunate tendency to catch the hunter as well as the hunted if one wasn't careful. Still, he trusted Holmes's judgment in such matters, trusted that his friend had anticipated the likely scenarios and prepared accordingly. The meeting-house looked different in the fog-dimmed evening light, smaller somehow, less theatrical without the crowd and candlelight of the previous night. A single lamp burned in the window, and when they knocked, it was Margaret Ashwood who answered, her face carefully neutral as she assessed them on the threshold. "You came," she said, and Watson couldn't tell whether she was pleased or merely unsurprised. "Mr. Blackwood is expecting you. Please, come in." The interior had been rearranged since the previous evening. The benches pushed to the walls, the space opened up to create a kind of receiving room. A small table had been set with tea things, an attempt at hospitality that struck Watson as both genuine and calculating. Blackwood rose from a chair near a small stove that provided minimal warmth, extending his hand with the easy grace of a man accustomed to welcoming strangers into confidence. "Gentlemen," he said warmly, "I'm glad you returned. Many hear the message, but few truly listen. Fewer still have the courage to pursue understanding beyond the initial curiosity. Please sit. Margaret, if you'd pour the tea." They settled into chairs arranged in a loose circle, and Watson accepted his teacup with the observation that this was all very civilized, very domestic. Nothing like the sinister conspiracy they suspected lurked beneath the surface. Which was, of course, precisely the point. Blackwood was demonstrating that he and his brotherhood were respectable, trustworthy, nothing to fear. "Last night," Holmes began, setting his teacup down with care, "you spoke of commitment, of what the new covenant requires. I wonder if you might be more specific. My friend and we're interested, genuinely interested, but we've been disappointed before by groups that promise much and deliver little." Blackwood nodded, as if he'd expected exactly this question. "A fair concern. London is full of societies promising secret knowledge, spiritual advancement, worldly success, most of them charlatans preying on the desperate. I appreciate your skepticism. It speaks to intelligence rather than cynicism." He leaned forward slightly, his manner becoming more intimate, more confidential. "The new covenant I speak of isn't metaphorical, nor is it distant. It's a practical arrangement, a mutual commitment. Those who join our brotherhood contribute resources. Money, yes, but also time, skills, labor. In exchange, they receive several things. First, spiritual community, a fellowship of those who understand that the old systems are failing, who seek new ways of making meaning in an industrial age. And second, Watson prompted, playing his role of interested skeptic. Second, material opportunity. The Brotherhood operates legitimate business enterprises. Members gain access to employment, to trade networks, to economic arrangements that provide stability in unstable times. We take care of our own, gentlemen. In a city where most workers are disposable, where illness or injury means destitution, we offer security through collective support. It was, Watson had to admit, a compelling pitch. Blackwood wasn't promising mystic transcendence or supernatural intervention. He was offering practical benefits wrapped in spiritual significance, a combination that would appeal to precisely the sort of working-class people who'd attended the previous evening's service. And third, Margaret Ashwood interjected, her voice cool and precise, access to knowledge. Mr. Blackwood has spent years studying biblical codes, ancient mysteries, patterns of meaning that the official churches have either forgotten or deliberately suppressed. This knowledge has practical applications. It helps us navigate the changing world, anticipate transformations before they occur, position ourselves advantageously. Holmes glanced at Watson with an expression that might have been impressed or might have been amused. It was difficult to tell through his performance of earnest interest. "Biblical codes? You mean like the 7 seals you mentioned?" "Exactly like that," Blackwood said, clearly pleased by the question. "The Book of Revelation isn't prophecy in the way most people understand it. Predictions of some distant apocalypse. It's a manual, a guide to transformation encoded in symbol and metaphor. Each seal represents a stage of change, a threshold to cross. Understanding the seals means understanding how systems collapse and rebuild, how old orders end and new ones begin." He stood and moved to the wall where that 7-segmented circle was painted, tracing the divisions with his finger. The first seal, White Horse, Crown, Conquest. This represents the initial break from old authority. The second, Red Horse, War, Conflict. The struggle that follows when established powers resist change, and so on through all 7 stages, ending in silence, in new beginning. "And Saturday's ceremony?" Holmes asked. "That involves these seals somehow?" Blackwood returned to his chair, his expression becoming more serious, more calculating. "Saturday represents a completion of the cycle. All 7 seals will be symbolically opened, marking the end of the old covenant, the old way of operating, and the beginning of the new. Those present will witness this transition, will participate in it, will be marked as initiates of the new order. But to be present, Ashwood added smoothly, requires demonstrated commitment. We can't simply open our most significant ceremonies to anyone who expresses casual interest. The knowledge shared, the activities conducted, they're for those who've proven themselves trustworthy. Here it comes, Watson thought. The pitch, the price, the moment where they'd discover exactly what Blackwood required in exchange for access to Saturday's proceedings. "We understand," Holmes said, reaching for the satchel he'd set beside his chair. "We're prepared to make a contribution, to demonstrate our sincerity. Would £50 be sufficient to establish our commitment?" Watson watched Blackwood's face carefully and saw something flicker there. Surprise, perhaps, at the amount, or possibly suspicion that two supposed clerks would have such resources readily available. But the moment passed quickly, replaced by satisfied approval. "That would be generous," Blackwood said carefully. "More than we typically require for initial membership. Such a contribution would certainly qualify you as initiates, would grant you access to tomorrow's ceremony. But I must ask, £50 is a significant sum for men in your professed occupations. Can you afford such a commitment without hardship?" It was a clever question, Watson realized. If they said yes too easily, they'd mark themselves as something other than struggling clerks. If they hesitated too much, they'd seem insufficiently committed. Holmes navigated it beautifully. "It's our savings," he said, allowing a slight tension to enter his voice. "Accumulated over several years, intended for establishing ourselves in business eventually, perhaps. But we've discussed it, my friend and I, and we agree that spiritual advancement is worth more than material security. If this is genuine, if you're offering what you claim, then it's the best investment we could make." Blackwood and Ashwood exchanged glances, and Watson saw satisfaction in both their expressions. They believed the story, or at least believed enough of it to proceed. Holmes produced the money. Actual notes, Watson noted, not a bank draft that could be traced, and placed it on the table between them. "We accept your contribution," Blackwood said formally, and Watson noted the shift in his tone, from conversational to something more ceremonial. "And we welcome you as initiates of the Brotherhood of the Second Covenant. Margaret, if you would prepare the seals." Ashwood moved to a small cabinet and withdrew 2 of those metal tokens they'd seen distributed the previous evening. Circles divided into 7 segments, each stamped with different symbols. She handed one to Holmes, one to Watson, and both men examined them with appropriate reverence, while actually noting every detail that might prove useful. "These mark you as initiates," Blackwood explained. "Tomorrow evening, you'll need them to gain entry to the ceremony. Come to Warehouse 7. I assume you know where that is. Working at the docks as you do. Arrive at midnight. The ceremony begins when the moon reaches its apex, approximately 12:30. The tide will be high then, perfect for the symbolic cleansing that's part of the ritual." "Warehouse 7, Holmes repeated, as if committing it to memory. "Midnight. Is there anything we should bring? Anything we need to prepare?" "Just yourselves and your tokens," Ashwood said, "and open minds. What you'll witness tomorrow, it will challenge your assumptions about what's possible, about the relationship between spiritual and material reality. Some find it overwhelming initially." Blackwood stood, signalling the meeting's conclusion, and Watson realized they'd accomplished their immediate objective. they'd secured access to tomorrow's ceremony, established themselves as part of Blackwood's inner circle. But he also recognized the danger they'd placed themselves in. If Blackwood suspected them, if their performance had contained any flaw that marked them as investigators rather than genuine seekers, then tomorrow's ceremony might become considerably more perilous than they'd anticipated. "One last thing," Holmes said, standing but not yet moving toward the door. "Last night, you mentioned that the spiritual and material aren't separate, that they're intertwined. I'm trying to understand what that means practically. When the seals are opened tomorrow, what actually happens? What will we see?" Blackwood smiled, and there was something almost fond in it, as if Holmes were a promising student asking exactly the right question. What you'll see depends on whether you're looking with spiritual eyes or material ones. Those who see only the material will observe a shipment arriving, cargo being unloaded, goods being distributed according to manifests and schedules. Those who see spiritually will recognize it as the opening of seals, the revelation of mysteries, the transition between covenants. "Both are true simultaneously," Ashwood added. "The cargo is real, the business legitimate. But the meaning, the significance, that's where the spiritual dimension exists. We're not asking you to deny material reality. We're asking you to see the layer of meaning that exists within and through it." It was, Watson thought as they took their leave and stepped back into the fog-wrapped street, a remarkably sophisticated theology for what was essentially a smuggling operation. Blackwood had created a belief system that could justify anything, that could reframe criminal activity as spiritual practice, that could convince followers they were participating in cosmic transformation while actually serving very earthly purposes. They walked in silence until they'd put significant distance between themselves and the meeting house, until they'd reached a broader street where other pedestrians and the occasional cab provided both cover and witnesses should they need them. "Well," Watson said finally, "we have our access. Tomorrow night we'll see exactly what Blackwood has planned." "Yes," Holmes replied, his voice tight with thought, "though I confess I'm troubled by how easily he accepted us. £50 is a significant sum, but for someone running an operation sophisticated enough to use biblical codes and maintain parallel spiritual and criminal enterprises, it's not so large that he should trust us immediately." "You think he suspects?" "I think he's confident, dangerously so. He believes his system is secure, that the theological camouflage is impenetrable. Or," Holmes paused, his expression darkening, "or he's planned for the possibility of infiltration and has countermeasures ready." Watson felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November cold. "Should we bring reinforcements tomorrow? Lestrade and some constables waiting nearby?" "Not yet. If we're wrong about the scope of the operation, if we act prematurely, we'll have accomplished nothing but alerting Blackwood that he's under investigation. No, we go alone tomorrow. We observe. We gather definitive evidence. And then we act." They found a cab and directed it toward Baker Street, both men settling into the worn leather seats with the weariness of those who'd spent the evening performing rather than simply being. The city rolled past the windows, London at its most mysterious, fog transforming familiar streets into something dreamlike, gas lamps creating pools of illumination that revealed as much as they concealed. Back at their rooms, Mrs. Hudson had left cold supper and a fire burning low, and they ate mechanically while reviewing what they'd learned. Holmes produced a map of the Thames and marked Warehouse 7, then traced the river's course upstream and down, considering approaches and exits, planning for contingencies that might or might not prove necessary. "The tide will be high at 12:30, Holmes murmured, studying the map, "which means boats can approach the warehouse dock easily, can unload quickly and depart before the tide turns. It's efficient timing for smuggling, the cover of night, the natural advantage of high water, the symbolic resonance of the full moon to satisfy the spiritual believers." "What do you think they're smuggling?" Watson asked. "Goods stolen from churches, like in that earlier case you mentioned." "Possibly, though I suspect it's larger than that now. Blackwood's operation has grown over 3 years. The religious artifacts were likely an early focus, items that had both monetary and symbolic value. But to maintain a warehouse, to operate legitimate trading companies as cover, to recruit and manage followers, that requires substantial capital. I'd wager he's diversified, that the ceremonial opening of seals tomorrow night will coincide with a shipment of considerably more profitable contraband." Watson considered this, trying to imagine what might be valuable enough to justify the elaborate system Blackwood had constructed. Opium? Stolen goods from colonial trade? Perhaps both, or something else entirely. Documents, securities, goods that bypass customs duties. We'll know tomorrow. Holmes set down his pen and rubbed his eyes, a gesture of fatigue Watson rarely saw from his friend. "I should rest. Tomorrow will require alertness, and I've spent too many nights this week sacrificing sleep to investigation." They retired, though Watson found himself lying awake despite exhaustion, his mind replaying the evening's conversation, searching for details he might have missed, warnings he should have heeded. Through the wall, he could hear Holmes moving about occasionally, suggesting his friend was similarly troubled by thoughts that wouldn't settle into sleep. Saturday arrived grey and cold, the fog having lifted enough to reveal low clouds that promised rain by evening. Watson woke to find Holmes already up, conducting some experiment at his chemistry table that involved precise measurements and patient observation. They moved through the day with the strange simultaneity of trying to maintain normal routine while preparing for decidedly abnormal evening activities. Holmes made arrangements with a street urchin, one of his irregular network of young informants, to deliver a sealed letter to Scotland Yard if they hadn't returned by dawn. "Insurance," he explained to Watson. "If something goes wrong tonight, at least Lestrade will know where we were and what we suspected." The afternoon stretched interminably, time moving with the sluggish reluctance of honey in winter. Watson tried to read, but found his attention wandering, tried to write, but produced only disjointed sentences. Holmes alternated between periods of intense focus on case notes and moments of complete stillness, sitting in his chair and staring at nothing, his mind clearly working through scenarios and contingencies. Evening came finally, darkness arriving early, as it did in late November, and they dressed for the night's work. Warm clothes that would blend into dockside shadows, sturdy boots in case rapid movement became necessary. Watson's revolver checked and loaded, despite Holmes' earlier dismissal of violence as likely. "Just in case," Watson said firmly when Holmes raised an eyebrow at the weapon. "I'd rather have it and not need it than the reverse." They departed Baker Street at 11, giving themselves ample time to reach the warehouse and observe the area before midnight. The The streets were quiet at this hour, the respectable world asleep or pretending to be, the less respectable world conducting its business in the shadows between gas lamps. They took a cab as far as Limehouse and walked the final distance, approaching Warehouse 7 from the side rather than directly, moving through the maze of dockside buildings with the careful attention of men who understood that observation was as important as action. The warehouse sat dark against the night sky, but as they watched from their concealed position, figures began to appear, arriving singly or in pairs, approaching the building's side entrance, where a single lamp burned. Watson recognized several faces from Thursday evening's service, working people in their Sunday clothes, looking nervous and excited and determined. Each arrival showed their token to someone at the door. Watson couldn't see clearly who was checking, but the process was efficient and careful. No one was admitted without proper identification. The Brotherhood's security, despite its spiritual trappings, was thoroughly professional. "There," Holmes whispered, pointing to a darker shadow near the water's edge. "A boat. 2 men, waiting. That's how the cargo will arrive. By river. Unloaded directly at the warehouse dock, transferred inside before anyone not part of the operation could observe." Watson looked where Holmes indicated and saw it. A low boat, dark painted, nearly invisible against the Thames's black water. The men aboard sat motionless, clearly waiting for some signal to approach. As midnight approached, they made their own approach to the warehouse, presenting their tokens to Margaret Ashwood, who stood at the entrance with a ledger, checking names against some list. She smiled at them with what seemed like genuine warmth. "Welcome, brothers. Go inside, find a place along the walls. The ceremony begins shortly. Mr. Blackwood will explain everything." The warehouse interior had been transformed. What Watson had observed days earlier as a practical space for storing cargo now resembled a peculiar hybrid of church and theatre. Candles had been arranged in 7 clusters around the perimeter, their light creating pools of illumination separated by shadows. In the centre, a large circle had been painted on the floor, divided into 7 segments, matching the symbol on their tokens. And at the far end, visible through the warehouse's large river-facing doors that had been opened to the night, the Thames flowed past, its surface reflecting moonlight that had broken through the clouds like a blessing or an accusation, depending on one's perspective. Perhaps 40 people were present, more than had attended Thursday's service, suggesting that Blackwood's full congregation was larger than initial observation had indicated. They stood along the walls as instructed, speaking in hushed voices, if they spoke at all, the atmosphere one of anticipation mixed with uncertainty. Blackwood entered through a side door, and the conversations died. He wore robes, simple black vestments that suggested clerical authority without claiming it explicitly. Behind him came Margaret Ashwood, similarly robed, and 2 men Watson didn't recognize, carrying between them a large chest that they placed at the center of the painted circle. "Brothers and sisters," Blackwood began, his voice carrying effortlessly through the warehouse's acoustic spaces. "You are gathered here to witness the end of one age and the beginning of another. The old covenant, the old way of operation, has served its purpose. But all systems must eventually transform or perish. Tonight, we inaugurate the new covenant. We open the 7 seals. We step together across the threshold into new possibility." Watson glanced at Holmes, and saw his friend's attention fixed not on Blackwood, but on the open doors, on the river beyond, clearly anticipating the arrival of whatever cargo this ceremony was designed to both mask and sanctify. Blackwood approached the chest and opened it slowly, dramatically, and Watson saw it contained 7 smaller boxes, each marked with a different symbol. The 7 seals, Blackwood intoned, each representing a stage of transformation, a mystery to be revealed. As I open each seal, understand that you are witnessing not merely symbol, but reality, not merely spiritual truth, but material manifestation. He opened the first box, withdrawing what appeared to be a small sculpture, something religious in nature, Watson thought, possibly medieval. The first seal, conquest, the breaking of old authority. This artifact was liberated from a church that no longer valued it, that stored it in darkness rather than displaying it for the faithful. Now it will be properly valued, properly used. The ceremony continued, each seal opened in turn, each box revealing some object. Religious artifacts, as Holmes had predicted, but also other items. What looked like shipping manifests, small bags that might contain anything, a leather portfolio of documents. Watson realized he was watching inventory being blessed, smuggled goods being sacralized, crime being transformed into ritual before his eyes. And then, as Blackwood opened the 6th seal, the sound they'd been anticipating arrived. A boat's hull gently bumping against the warehouse dock, voices speaking in low tones, the creak of cargo being moved. And now, Blackwood announced, his timing impeccable, the 7th seal, the completion of the cycle. The new covenant begins not in some distant heaven, but here, now, in the material world that is also spiritual, in the practical reality that is also sacred mystery. Watson saw it then, saw how perfectly Blackwood had choreographed everything so that the arrival of smuggled cargo would coincide with the ceremony's climax, so that his followers would witness illegal goods being unloaded while believing they were observing the apocalyptic fulfillment of prophesied transformation. It was audacious, brilliant, and deeply cynical, the work of someone who understood human psychology well enough to exploit faith itself as camouflage for crime. And in that moment, as cargo began moving from boat to warehouse, while the congregation watched in reverent silence, as Blackwood prepared to open the 7th seal and declare the new covenant established, Watson saw Holmes's expression change, saw recognition, then calculation, then decision flash across his friend's face in rapid succession. "Now," Holmes whispered, and before Watson could ask what he meant, his friend's voice rang out across the wheelhouse, clear and authoritative, and completely shattering the ceremony's carefully constructed atmosphere. "Stop. In the name of the law, I order everyone to remain where they are. This ceremony is concluded. This operation is finished. Mr. Blackwood, you and your associates are under arrest for smuggling, theft, fraud, and conspiracy." The warehouse erupted into chaos, shouts of confusion, people trying to flee toward exits. Blackwood's expression transforming from spiritual authority to cold calculation in an instant. Watson drew his revolver, not pointing it at anyone but making its presence clear, his medical training somehow translating into the steady hands and clear head that crisis required. And outside, as if summoned by Holmes's declaration, whistles sounded. Police whistles, multiple ones, converging on the warehouse from several directions. Watson saw Holmes smile grimly and understood. His friend, had arranged backup. After all, had coordinated with Scotland Yard despite his earlier protestations, had ensured that when the moment came, they wouldn't face Blackwood's organisation alone. The ritual was interrupted. The seals, not all of them opened, remained forever incomplete. And in the confusion and lamplight and shouting, as police constables poured into the warehouse and began making arrests, Watson caught a glimpse of Blackwood's face and saw there not anger, but something almost like relief, as if some part of him had been waiting for this moment, had perhaps even desired it, the revelation that would free him from the elaborate pretense he'd constructed, the interruption that would release him from playing prophet to people who deserved better than his particular brand of salvation. The morning after arrived with the particular quality of light that follows storms, clear, almost crystalline, as if London itself had been washed clean and was tentatively exploring the possibility of optimism. Watson woke to find sunlight streaming through his window, an occurrence rare enough in late November to feel like commentary on the previous night's events, as if even the weather was acknowledging that something significant had concluded. He dressed and descended to find Holmes already seated at the breakfast table, the morning papers spread before him with their inevitable accounts of the night's dramatic arrests. The Times had given it prominent placement. Major smuggling operation disrupted. Religious society exposed as criminal front. The Telegraph's headline was more sensational. Devil's disciples defeated. Holmes unmasks Thames conspiracy. "I see the press has enjoyed themselves," Watson observed, pouring tea and settling into his chair with the grateful attention of a man who'd spent a considerable portion of the previous night giving statements to Scotland Yard. Holmes looked up from the Times with an expression of mild distaste. "They always do. Though I notice they've managed to get several crucial details wrong while successfully conveying the general melodrama. Blackwood is not, as the Telegraph suggests, a criminal mastermind of Mephistophelian cunning. He's a moderately intelligent man who constructed an elaborate system that worked until it didn't. Still, the operation is concluded. Blackwood and Ashwood are in custody, the smuggled goods recovered, the warehouse secured. Surely that counts as success. Success in the immediate sense, certainly. Holmes set down the paper, his expression contemplative. Though I confess to feeling rather less satisfaction than such cases typically provide. We've arrested the architects and dismantled the structure, but the conditions that made the structure attractive, the poverty, the powerlessness, the hunger for meaning, those remain entirely unaddressed. Watson spread marmalade on his toast with the careful precision that bought him time to formulate response. His friend was in one of his philosophical moods, the sort that followed cases involving human complexity rather than simple villainy. You're thinking of the congregation, the people who genuinely believed in Blackwood's new covenant. I'm thinking that we've taken from them something they valued: community, purpose, the sense that their lives mattered in some cosmic scheme, and replaced it with what? The knowledge that they were deceived? The humiliation of having their faith exploited? These aren't outcomes that inspire celebration, Watson. Mrs. Hudson appeared with fresh toast and the Post, her efficient movements a comforting reminder that life's routines continued regardless of philosophical complications. Among the letters was one bearing Scotland Yard's official seal, which Holmes opened with more curiosity than enthusiasm. "It's from Lestrade," he said, scanning the contents. He wants us to come by this afternoon. Apparently, Blackwood has been cooperative isn't quite the right word. Confessional, perhaps? He's been talking rather extensively about his operation, about his theology, about the relationship between the two. Lestrade thinks we might find the conversation illuminating. Do you want to go? Holmes was quiet for a moment, staring at the letter with an expression Watson couldn't quite interpret. Yes, he said finally. Yes, I think I do. I want to understand what he thought he was accomplishing, whether he believed his own theology or whether it was always simply camouflage for crime. The distinction matters, somehow. They finished breakfast and spent the morning attending to various practical matters, correspondence that had accumulated during the week's investigation, a telegram to the client whose case had initiated their involvement, though that client had turned out to be Blackwood himself, using a false name to ensure Holmes's attention. Various administrative details that accumulated around even successfully concluded cases. Shortly after lunch, they made their way to Scotland Yard, that imposing edifice of Victorian authority where the machinery of law ground through its cases with the patient inexorability of mills processing grain. Lestrade met them in his office, looking more tired than triumphant, despite the significant arrest his department could claim credit for. Holmes, Dr. Watson, he said, gesturing them to chairs. Thank you for coming. I've been interviewing Blackwood most of the morning, and I confess he's unlike any criminal I've previously encountered. He's not denying anything. Quite the contrary. He's explaining everything in exhaustive detail. But he maintains that what he was doing wasn't criminal in any meaningful sense, that we've misunderstood the nature of his enterprise. May we speak with him? Holmes asked, and Watson heard genuine curiosity in his friend's voice, the scholar's interest in understanding systems of thought, regardless of their moral implications. I was hoping you'd ask. He's actually requested to speak with you specifically. Said something about how you were the only person who'd properly understood his code, which, I suppose, is a compliment of sorts, though coming from a man facing multiple criminal charges, perhaps not the sort one wants. They were led through Scotland Yard's warren of corridors to the holding cells, that progression from the building's public faces to its hidden machinery of detention and processing. Blackwood sat in a small interview room, still wearing the clothes from the previous night, though someone had removed his ceremonial robes. He looked up as they entered, and Watson was struck by how ordinary he appeared. Not the spiritual leader, not the criminal mastermind, just a middle-aged man facing consequences he'd perhaps always known would eventually arrive. Mr. Holmes, Blackwood said, something almost like warmth in his voice. Thank you for coming. And Dr. Watson, though I suppose that's not actually your profession at the docks, is it? You played your roles well. I almost believed you. Were who you claimed to be. Almost, Holmes said, taking a seat across the table from Blackwood, while Watson positioned himself slightly to the side, observer rather than primary participant. I suspected from the beginning, Blackwood admitted, the timing of your arrival, the quickness with which you committed to significant financial contribution, certain qualities of bearing that suggested more education and authority than clerks typically possess. But I allowed the deception to continue, because I was curious. I wanted to see if you would understand what I'd constructed, whether you'd appreciate the elegance of the system even while opposing its purposes. The biblical code was elegant, Holmes acknowledged, using Revelation as both spiritual text and practical cipher that demonstrated sophisticated understanding of how meaning can be layered, how the same information can be read differently depending on the interpretive lens applied. Blackwood leaned forward slightly, his expression animated in a way it hadn't been moments before. Exactly. That's precisely it. The old covenant, by which I mean the old way of organizing criminal enterprise. It operated through brute concealment. Secret meetings, coded messages, constant fear of discovery. But I realized that the best concealment isn't hiding. It's displaying something in a context where people dismiss it as meaningless. Religious mysticism, Watson said. Victorian society is so saturated with spiritual movements that one more group claiming special knowledge simply blends into the general noise. More than that, Blackwood said. It's about understanding that people see what they expect to see. Present criminal organization in the trappings of spiritual seeking, and skeptics dismiss it as delusion while believers embrace it as truth. Both perspectives serve my purposes because neither sees the complete picture. The system that is genuinely both spiritual practice and criminal enterprise, not one disguising the other, but truly integrated. Holmes studied Blackwood with the focused attention he typically reserved for particularly interesting specimens. Did you believe it yourself, the theology you preached? Was it sincere or strategic? Does the distinction matter? Blackwood countered. I created a system of meaning that served practical purposes. Whether I personally believed every tenet is perhaps less relevant than whether the system functioned, whether it provided my followers with something they valued while simultaneously accomplishing material objectives. It matters, Holmes said quietly, because belief and cynicism lead to different outcomes. A cynic exploiting others' faith will eventually make mistakes born of contempt. A true believer might genuinely think they're serving their followers even while harming them. The psychology matters because it determines the nature of the crime. Blackwood was silent for a long moment, his expression shifting through several states before settling into something that might have been sadness or might have been exhaustion. I suppose I believed it when I began. I was a clerk. Did your investigations reveal that? A clerk in a shipping firm, watching cargo move through warehouses, watching fortunes being made by men no more intelligent than myself, distinguished only by accidents of birth and capital. And I was angry about that, angry at the injustice of it, the randomness. He paused, looking at his hands as if they belonged to someone else. I started studying Revelation because I was genuinely seeking meaning, genuinely trying to understand why the world was so profoundly unjust. And I found in that text a kind of blueprint, not for accepting injustice, but for understanding transformation, for recognizing that all systems eventually collapse and rebuild. That gave me an idea. What if I could facilitate that transformation, could position myself and those who followed me to benefit from the rebuilding? So you created the Brotherhood, Watson said. I created a community of people who were as angry and powerless as I had been, and I offered them a way to transform their circumstances. Yes, it involved criminal activity, smuggling goods that bypassed customs duties, trafficking in stolen religious artifacts that churches had hoarded rather than using to help their parishes. But it also provided my followers with income, with purpose, with the sense that they were part of something larger than their individual struggles. Holmes leaned back in his chair, his expression unreadable. And Margaret Ashwood, what was her role in this theological criminal synthesis? Margaret understood the practical realities better than I did, Blackwood said, and there was genuine respect in his voice. She'd been a governess, watching wealthy families waste resources on frivolities, while the people who actually maintained their comfortable lives starved on inadequate wages. She brought organizational skills to the Brotherhood, transformed my theological vision into functional structure. If I was the prophet, she was the administrator who made prophecy practical. She's also facing significant charges, Lestrade interjected from his position by the door. Charges she's been considerably less philosophical about than you, Mr. Blackwood. She maintains that she was simply following your spiritual guidance, that she believed the Brotherhood was a legitimate religious organization. Blackwood's expression darkened slightly. Margaret always understood exactly what we were doing, but she's pragmatic enough to construct a defense that might reduce her sentence. I don't blame her for that. We each handle consequences according to our nature. Holmes stood and walked to the small window that looked out onto Scotland Yard's courtyard, where routine police work continued, regardless of philosophical conversations in interview rooms. "You sent me the letter," he said. "Not quite a question. You invited investigation. Why?" "Because I wanted someone to understand," Blackwood said simply. "I wanted someone intelligent enough to decode the cipher, to see the system I'd constructed, to appreciate its elegance, even while dismantling it. Is that vanity? Probably. But I spent 3 years building something genuinely innovative. A criminal organization that was also a spiritual movement, a theology that was also practical economics, and I wanted that achievement recognized before it ended." "You knew it would end?" "All systems end, Mr. Holmes. That was the core insight of my theology. The old covenant always gives way to the new. I simply didn't realize I'd built an old covenant myself, that the Brotherhood had become the kind of rigid structure it was designed to replace. Perhaps that's the inevitable trajectory. Revolution becomes institution, becomes target for the next revolution." Watson found himself unexpectedly moved by Blackwood's analysis, by the self-awareness that seemed genuine despite the criminal context. "What happens to your followers now, the people who genuinely believed in the new covenant you promised?" "They'll feel betrayed, I imagine," Blackwood said quietly. "They'll return to their lives with less than they had before, not just materially, but spiritually. I gave them hope that they mattered, that their suffering had meaning, that transformation was possible. Taking that away, perhaps that's the worst thing I've done. Not the smuggling or the theft, but the offering, and then withdrawal of meaning." Holmes turned from the window, his expression complex. "You could have accomplished much of what you wanted legitimately. Adult education, cooperative economics, community organization. These are legal means of providing people with purpose and improving their circumstances. Legal means that operate within a system designed to maintain existing inequalities," Blackwood countered. "I wanted transformation, not amelioration. I wanted to prove that the system could be beaten, that intelligence and organization could triumph over inherited privilege. Criminal methods were part of the point. They demonstrated that the rules themselves were arbitrary, that law protected property rather than people." "And yet," Holmes said, "you're in custody, while the system you sought to challenge continues unchanged. What did you prove, ultimately, except that even clever criminality eventually encounters the patient machinery of law?" Blackwood smiled, but there was no humor in it. "I proved that it's possible, at least temporarily, that people will follow a vision if it's compelling enough, that faith and felony can coexist, that meaning can be manufactured, that transformation, however brief, is achievable. Perhaps that's sufficient legacy for a clerk who decided to become something more. They spoke for a while longer, ranging over details of the operation, the extent of the smuggling network, the scope of Blackwood's ambitions, before their interruption. Lestrade took notes with the patience of a man who understood that comprehensive testimony, even from cooperative criminals, required time and attention. But Watson found his mind wandering, thinking about the people in that warehouse the previous night, about faces that had believed they were witnessing spiritual transformation, and instead had seen police raids and arrests. Finally, Holmes indicated they'd learned what they came for, and they took their leave of Blackwood with the odd formality of academics concluding a scholarly discussion, rather than detective and criminal ending an interview. In the corridor outside, Lestrade expressed satisfaction with the case's resolution while Holmes remained contemplative, clearly still processing the conversation. Back on the street, walking toward Baker Street, through afternoon light that was already beginning its surrender to evening, Watson ventured the question that had been building through the interview. Do you think he actually believed his theology? Or was it always simply sophisticated justification for criminal activity? Holmes was quiet for several steps, his walking stick tapping rhythmically on the pavement. I think he believed it became true through implementation. He created a system where spiritual seeking and criminal enterprise were genuinely integrated, where the theology wasn't disguise but actual organizing principle. Whether he believed it initially matters less than the fact that he created something where belief and cynicism, faith and crime became functionally inseparable. That's rather disturbing. It's human, Holmes said, echoing his own observation from earlier in the week. We're remarkably skilled at constructing systems that serve our interests while convincing ourselves we're serving higher purposes. Blackwood was simply more conscious and deliberate about it than most. They walked in companionable silence, London flowing around them with its afternoon rhythms. Workers heading home, shops closing, the city performing its daily transition from commerce to domesticity. Watson found himself thinking about the broader implications of the case, about how many other elaborate justifications were operating throughout the city, how many systems existed where crime and faith, exploitation and meaning, harm and help were wound together so thoroughly that separating them became effectively impossible. Back at Baker Street, Mrs. Hudson had tea waiting, and they settled into their chairs with the grateful relief of men returning to familiar territory after journeying through complicated moral landscapes. Holmes picked up his pipe, that constant companion through contemplation, while Watson retrieved his notebook, already beginning to structure the case into narrative form. "You'll write this one up for publication?" Holmes asked, though it wasn't really a question. "I thought I might, eventually, though I'm not sure how to frame it. The reader expects clear villains and heroes, simple morality. This case feels murkier." "Then perhaps that's what you should convey, the murkiness. The reality that crime isn't always brutish and obvious, that harm can be done by people with genuine grievances, that exploitation can coexist with community, that even obviously illegal activity can provide things that legal society fails to offer." Watson made notes, considering how to balance accuracy with narrative clarity, how to tell a story that honored complexity without becoming impossibly convoluted. Outside, darkness was claiming London completely, the lamplighters making their rounds, each gas lamp blooming into life like small acts of defiance against the encroaching night. The people in the warehouse, Watson said, the congregation, what becomes of them? Some will face charges if they can be proven to have knowingly participated in criminal activity. Most, I suspect, will simply return to their lives, to the factories and shops and labouring jobs that Blackwood's Brotherhood briefly promised to transcend. They'll be poorer, both materially and spiritually. They'll have learned that seeking meaning makes one vulnerable to exploitation. Whether they'll become more cynical or simply more careful in their future seeking remains to be seen. That's rather grim. Holmes relit his pipe, smoke curling upward in patterns that suggested complexity, without quite achieving coherence. It's realistic. We solved the criminal case, Watson, but we can't solve the conditions that made Blackwood's offer appealing. That requires transformations beyond the scope of detective work, economic reform, social restructuring, new systems of meaning that don't depend on exploitation. Those are projects for others, for movements and generations, rather than individuals. And yet, we do what we can. Holmes agreed. We pursue particular truths, solve specific puzzles, bring individual criminals to account. We can't fix the world, but we can maintain the principle that intelligence and observation matter, that deception can be unraveled, that elaborate systems of justification eventually encounter the patient work of logic and evidence. The fire crackled its agreement, or perhaps its skepticism. As always, it was difficult to tell with fires. Mrs. Hudson appeared with dinner. The conversation shifted to lighter topics, and the evening settled into the comfortable rhythms that characterize Baker Street at its best. Two friends sharing space and silence, occasionally exchanging observations, mostly just existing in the companionable understanding that comes from shared experience and mutual respect. Later, as Watson prepared for bed, he stood at his window looking out at fog-wrapped London, that vast organism of humanity and ambition sprawling in all directions, full of seekers and deceivers, believers and cynics, people trying to make meaning in circumstances that often seemed designed to deny it. Somewhere out there, Blackwood's former followers were perhaps lying awake, processing betrayal, rethinking everything they'd believed, trying to salvage something from the wreckage of faith exploited. And somewhere else, other Blackwoods were perhaps constructing new systems, new theologies, new elaborate structures that would blur the lines between spiritual seeking and practical crime, that would offer meaning wrapped in exploitation, that would eventually require their own homes to unravel their particular grammar of deception. The work was never finished, Watson realized. The cases might conclude, the criminals might be arrested, the immediate mysteries might be solved. But the conditions that generated mysteries, the poverty and powerlessness, the hunger for meaning, the creativity humans brought to both helping and harming each other, those persisted, generating new puzzles as surely as London generated fog. He climbed into bed finally, pulling the blankets close against November's chill, and as sleep claimed him, his last conscious thought was gratitude for Holmes and his patient pursuit of truth, for Mrs. Hudson and her steady maintenance of sanctuary, for Baker Street and its promise that however complex the world became, There remained places where logic could still triumph, where questions could still find answers, where the devil's cipher, however elaborate, could eventually be unsealed and understood. In his own room, Holmes remained awake longer still, smoking in the darkness, thinking about codes and theologies, about crime and faith, about the elaborate systems humans constructed to give meaning to existence, and the patient work required to understand those systems fully. The case was closed, the mystery solved, but the larger questions about belief and deception, about harm and help, about the relationship between spiritual seeking and material reality, those remained open, awaiting future investigations, future efforts to pass the grammar of human complexity. The city slept, or pretended to, while beneath its surface countless stories unfolded, some headed toward resolution, some toward complication, most toward something between those poles, where life actually occurred in all its messy, mysterious, occasionally transcendent ordinariness. And on Baker Street, in rooms warmed by fading firelight and the accumulated comfort of years of friendship, the detective and the doctor rested, their latest adventure concluded, their partnership enduring, their commitment to pursuing truth despite complexity undiminished by the recognition that truth itself was often more complicated than any fiction could capture. The devil's cipher had been solved, the seals had been unsealed, logic had triumphed, gently, over fear and deception. And tomorrow would bring new mysteries, new challenges, new opportunities to apply intelligence and observation to the endless puzzle of human behavior in all its creativity and contradiction. But that was tomorrow. Tonight, Baker Street slept, and London kept its remaining secrets, and the fog returned with patient inevitability, wrapping the city in its customary embrace, promising that mystery would always find a home in the greatest metropolis the world had ever known.